The sign was hand-painted, the letters uneven, like whoever wrote it had wanted to get it over with fast. Free. Nobody wants her. It hung from a nail driven straight through a scrap of packing plastic, and it swung a little every time the crowd shouldered past the stall, and underneath it, chained to a post by a collar no thicker than a finger, sat a woman who was not human. Rennick Vale had walked this row of the Havern Docks Market 1,000 times without stopping. He stopped now. Rain needled down through the gaps in the corrugated awnings, hissing where it hit the hot vent pipes, and the whole bazaar smelled the way it always did: ozone, fry oil, wet rust, and under it something sweetish and chemical that never fully washed out of the docks no matter how hard it rained. Neon signage buzzed pink and green over stalls selling coolant cells and knockoff filament and second-hand exosuit joints. And none of the 1,000 small tragedies of a border market had made him break stride in 3 years of working this street. The sign did. He stood there a second too long, and a man built like a shipping crate stepped out from behind the stall counter, wiping his hands on an apron gone the color of old motor oil. "You buying, you looking, or you blocking my counter?" the man said. "Ossic Thane." Rennick knew the name the way you knew every name that mattered on the docks, the way you knew which stalls sold real parts and which stalls sold you back your own stolen inventory at triple markup. "Sign says free," Rennick said. "Sign says what it says." Thane's eyes flicked toward the woman chained to the post, then away, the way you'd glance at a piece of broken furniture you were embarrassed to still own. "You want her, you're welcome to her. Save me the feed bill." Rennick made himself look at her properly then, because looking away first felt like something he wasn't willing to do in front of Ossic Thane. She sat with her knees drawn up, spine straight despite the collar, despite 3 days, he'd guessed 3 days, going by the state of the rag she wore and the hollows under her eyes, of sitting on wet ferrocrete in a market that had decided she was worth less than the packing plastic her death sentence was written on. Her skin was a pale, luminous gray lavender, like dusk caught under the surface of it, and her ears tapered to fine points half hidden in hair so dark a silver it looked black except where the neon caught it. Her eyes were enormous, black on black, no white to them at all, and they were fixed on him with a wariness so total it had stopped looking like fear and started looking like arithmetic, measuring him, cataloging him, waiting to see which kind of danger he was. "What's wrong with her?" Rennick said. It wasn't really a question. On this street nothing was free unless it was broken. "Illin," Thane said, like that answered it. "You know Illin stock, they're worth good money, bond cents, best translators in the reach, good hands, good backs." This one snapped. "Somebody scrambled her sense right out of her skull before she ever hit my yard. Can't bond, can't translate, can't do the thing that makes an Illin worth the transport fees. She's dead weight I've been feeding for 3 weeks on a debt I already ate the loss on. So," he spread his hands, "free." The woman didn't flinch at any of it. She watched Rennick instead, and something about the stillness of her, the refusal to perform grief or gratitude for an audience that had already decided the verdict, put a small cold hook somewhere under his ribs. "She got a name?" he asked. "They don't put names on the manifest for broken stock." Thane was already losing interest, eyes drifting toward a woman haggling over drive coils 2 stalls down. "You want the collar off. That's a 15-credit release tax, station law, not mine. Otherwise she's yours to walk off my lot and I don't care what you do with her." 15 credits. Rennick had exactly 31 credits left on his chit until Harlan paid him out at the end of the week, and every rational calculation he'd built his life on for the last 3 years told him to walk past this stall the way he'd walked past 100 like it. A man alone on the dock stayed alone and stayed solvent by minding exactly one business, which was his own. He crouched instead, so he was eye level with her, and the movement made her go very still, the particular stillness of something that has learned stillness keeps you alive. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "It was a stupid thing to say." Everyone who was about to hurt you said it too. But it was the only true thing he had, so he said it anyway, low, not performing it for Thane or the row of stalls or anyone else. Her black eyes moved over his face, the 2-day stubble, the burned scar along his jaw from a coil fire that had nearly taken his eye out 2 winters back, the grease under his nails that never fully scrubbed clean, cataloging him the way she'd cataloging everything else. Whatever she found, she didn't share it. But her chin came up a fraction, and that was answer enough for him. 15 credits, Rennick said, standing, and dug the chit out of his jacket before he could talk himself out of it. Thane took the payment without ceremony, thumbed the collar release, and the thing sprang open with a small, ugly click and fell into the mud. The woman's hand went to her throat on reflex, fingers pressed to the raw ring the collar had worn into her skin, and for just a second, 1 second, gone as fast as it came, something moved behind those black eyes that wasn't wariness at all. "Congratulations," Thane said, already turning back to his coils. "You just bought yourself a broken translator nobody in 6 systems wants. Hope she's good company." Rennick didn't answer him. He held out his hand to the woman, not grabbing, not pulling, just offered, palm up, the way you'd offer a hand to somebody standing at the edge of something they weren't sure they should cross. She looked at the hand a long moment. Then she looked past him once fast at the crowd, and Rennick, following her glance out of instinct more than thought, caught the tail end of it. A man in a long gray coat at the mouth of the row, unremarkable in every way except that he was the only person in the entire crowded shouting market who was standing still, watching them, and did not look away when Rennick's eyes found his. The man in gray turned, and was gone into the crowd before Rennick could decide whether he'd imagined the wrongness of it. The woman was on her feet by the time he looked back, having risen without taking his hand, testing weight on legs that had been folded under her too long. She swayed once. He caught her elbow, carefully, the way you'd catch something you didn't yet have permission to touch, and she let him, which told him more than anything Thane had said. "Come on," Rennick said, "off the row at least, then you can decide if you want anything else from me." She didn't speak. He'd learn later that wasn't defiance, or not only defiance. It was that Illan Court common came out of her clipped and careful, like a language she'd once worn as easily as her own skin, and now had to reach for through wreckage. But she moved when he moved, half a step behind, her eyes cutting corners and doorways the whole way like she expected the market itself to close its teeth on her. And behind them, somewhere in the wet neon crowd, the man in the gray coat was already reporting in. Rennick's shop sat 4 rows back from the water stalls, in a stretch of the docks where the awnings gave way to actual roofs, and the smell of fry oil gave way to the smell of hot metal and flux, Vale Salvage, though the sign over the door had lost the L and the E decades before Rennick had ever taken the place over, so it just read VA-SALVAG to anyone who bothered to look up. Harlan Meeks had built the yard 40 years back, salvaged half the parts himself off dead ships towed in from the Reach, and these days ran it more as a place to sit and complain about the weather than an actual business, which suited Rennick fine, because it meant nobody asked too many questions about who he brought home. He got her through the door before the questions could start anyway. Harlan was in the back, elbow-deep in a coolant manifold, and didn't look up until the door chimed. "You're early," Harlan said, then looked up and stopped. The woman stood just inside the doorway, dripping, arms wrapped around herself, eyes doing their fast, careful sweep of the shop. Exits, cover, the old man with the wrench, the boy with the burned scar who'd bought her, and Harlan set the wrench down slow, the way you'd set down anything in front of something that had learned to read sudden movements as threat. "Illan," Harlan said quietly. Not a question either. Everyone on the docks knew Illan on sight, the pointed ears, the void black eyes, the way their skin seemed to hold light instead of reflect it. Harlan had crewed transports out to the Reach before his knees gave out, 40 years back, when the Ilin courts still traded with the border stations on something like equal terms. Where'd you get her, boy? Thane stall, sign said free. Harlan's jaw worked. Free don't happen on this street, you know that. I know it now, Rennick said, and something in his voice must have carried the whole ugly shape of the transaction, because Harlan didn't push further. He just looked at the woman a long moment, the careful, sad look of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to, and then he reached slow into the cold box under the workbench and came out with half a wrapped ration bar, and held it out, not to Rennick, to her, arm extended, movement slow. You eat, girl, he said. Been a while, looks like. She looked at the bar. She looked at Harlan's weathered, unremarkable face, at his old scarred hands, at the wrench he'd set down without picking back up. And something in her rigid shoulders came down by one careful degree, not trust, not yet, but the recognition that trust might, eventually, someday, be a thing that existed in this room. She took the bar. She didn't eat it in front of them. She held it in both hands like something that might be taken back, and Rennick understood, watching her, that whatever had been done to her before she ever reached Thane's stall had taught her that kindness came with a bill attached, and she was still waiting to see when this one arrived. What's your name? Rennick asked her, gently, crouching again to bring himself down to her eye level rather than looming over her the way Thane had loomed, the way, he'd guess, most people who'd handled her in the last weeks had loomed. She was quiet long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice roughened from disuse, careful over every syllable like she was placing stones across a river. Vessa. Just that. No surname, no title, no context. Rennick nodded like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, a name traded between two people in a salvage shop on a rainy dock, and didn't push for more. Rennick, he said, this is Harlan, this is his yard well. Our yard, some days he lets me pretend. That got nothing from her, not even the ghost of amusement, but he saw her file the names away regardless, the way she seemed to file away everything, cataloging the room, the exits, the two men who had not yet hurt her. He didn't know yet that the man in the gray coat had already sent word up a relay chain that ended 40 light minutes away, in a chamber with a view of a dead world, where a man called Corvin Dreeth was about to be told that the last loose thread of his conquest had just been bought off a scrap dealer's stall for 15 credits, and was, against every calculation Dreeth had made 3 weeks ago, still alive. He only knew that the woman named Vessa sat by the workbench's small heater with a ration bar clutched in both hands, watching him with black eyes that had stopped cataloging threats, for the moment, and started, very carefully, very slowly, cataloging something else instead. She slept that first night on a folded engine tarp in the corner behind the parts racks, because when Rennick offered her the cot in the back room she'd looked at the door, and the lock on it, and something in her face made it clear that a room with one door and one lock was not a room she trusted yet. He didn't argue. He brought the tarp out, folded twice for padding, and a blanket that smelled like solder flux no matter how many times Harlan washed it, and left her a lantern turned low, and went to sleep on the shop's ratty office couch with the strange, unfamiliar awareness that there was another heartbeat in the building. She was awake before he was. He came out at first light to find her sitting exactly where he'd left her, knees drawn up, eyes open, watching the door, and he understood, with the flat, unglamorous clarity of a man who fixed machines for a living, that she probably hadn't slept at all. You don't have to do that, he said. Watch the door, nobody's coming through it. Someone always comes through it, Vessa said. It was the first full sentence he'd heard from her, and the comment came out clipped, formal, each word set down like she still didn't trust the language to hold her meaning. Eventually, it is only a matter of counting the hours. He didn't have an answer for that, because on the docks she wasn't wrong. He offered her water. She took it and drank like she'd been rationing herself for longer than the 3 days at Thane's stall accounted for. He offered her the washroom, and a shirt of his own that would swallow her twice over. and she took that too, disappearing behind the curtain that served as a door and coming out 10 minutes later scrubbed of 3 weeks of market grime, her dark silver hair damp and pushed back from her face, and Rennick had to look away for a second, because clean and upright and no longer folded defensively into herself. He made himself find a different word than the one that came first, striking. Not in the practiced, performed way Thane's other stock might have been dressed up to look, but in the plain fact of her, the strange pale luminous gray of her skin catching the shop's overhead light like something that had never been meant for a place this ugly. "You're staring," Vesa said, not looking at him, drying her hands on the hem of his shirt. "Sorry." "You should not apologize for looking. You should apologize for what you decide to do about it." Her black eyes flicked to him then, sharp, testing, the same arithmetic from the market stall running behind them. "That is where the men who bought Illan stock before you always failed the test." "There were others," he said, not a question. "There are always others." She said it flat, no self-pity in it, the way you'd report a fact about weather. "You are the first who paid the release tax before deciding what he wanted from me." Rennick didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything clever. He just went to the cold box and pulled out 2 more ration bars and set them on the workbench, one for her, one for himself, and said, "Eat. Then, if you want, you can tell me what happened to you, and if you don't want, that's fine too. I'm not going to make you pay for the bar with a story." She looked at him a long moment. Then slowly, she sat and unwrapped the bar and ate properly this time, not hoarding it, and Harlan, coming in through the back with a crate of scavenged relay parts, took one look at the two of them sitting at his workbench and said nothing at all, which from Harlan was its own kind of blessing. She told him pieces over the next 3 days, in the gaps between work, never all at once, the way you'd hand someone a mosaic one tile at a time and trust them not to demand the whole picture before they'd earned it. She was Illan. He'd guessed that from the ears and the eyes, but she filled in what the word meant in ways the docs never bothered to teach. The Illan were bond folk, she told him, their whole society built around a sense the collar had never fully managed to kill in her, even when someone else had a thread of feeling that ran between an Illan and the people she chose to open herself to, parent to child, friend to friend, spouse to spouse. It made them prized as translators and negotiators across the reach, because an Illan who bonded with you could feel faintly whether you meant what you said. It made their marriages, when they came, unbreakable in a way most species couldn't fake. And it made an Illan without it, a bond-severed Illan, worth exactly nothing on any market that mattered, because the one thing that made an Illan valuable was gone. "Somebody did that to you," Rennick said. "Severed it on purpose." "Yes," Vesa said, and for the first time since he'd met her, something in her voice went thin and careful in a different way, not wariness now, but the effort of holding something very heavy very still. "It was done 3 weeks ago, in a room with no windows, by men who were very good at their work and did not enjoy it any less for the skill. I do not remember all of it. I remember enough." "Why?" She was quiet a long moment, turning the ration wrapper over in her hands, and Rennick made himself wait rather than push, because he'd learned in 3 days that pushing made her retreat somewhere he couldn't follow. "Because bond sense is how my line is verified," she said finally. "A thou cannot fake the bond. It has never been counterfeited, not in 400 years. It is the one thing a usurper cannot buy or forge or threaten into existing. So if you wish to remove a thou claim from a throne permanently, quietly, in a way that leaves no body for anyone to mourn publicly, you do not need to kill her. You only need to take the one thing that proves who she is, and then sell what's left of her into a border market 3 systems away, tagged as broken stock, and let time and distance do the rest." Rennick sat with that a moment, the shop's small heater ticking, Harlan's wrench going quiet somewhere in the back like the old man had stopped pretending not to listen. "You're saying you're royalty," he said. "I am saying I was the last living heir of the House of Thal, on the world of Illandra until 3 weeks ago, when a man named Corvin Dreeth decided that inconvenient. Vessa's black eyes came up to meet his, steady now, none of the market stall wariness left in them, only something colder and older. He did not kill me because killing a thou makes a martyr, and martyrs are dangerous to a new regent trying to look legitimate. He made me nothing instead, unbonded, worthless. Free, the sign says. He is not wrong that I am worth nothing by the only measure my own people have ever used to value an Illan woman. That's a stupid measure, Rennick said before he could stop himself. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, nothing so easy as that, but a small crack in the composure she'd been holding since the market, like a window opening a half-inch in a room that had been sealed shut a long time. It is the only measure I have ever known, she said. You will have to forgive me if it takes longer than 3 days to believe there might be another one. Take as long as you need, Rennick said, and meant it, and didn't yet understand that somewhere across the docks, the man in the gray coat had already met twice with Ossic Thane, offering him 10 times the release tax to remember exactly which shop the broken Illan stock had walked into. Thane came to the yard himself on the 4th day, which told Rennick more than any conversation could have that the stakes had changed since the market row. He didn't come in. He stood in the open bay door with 2 men behind him who weren't dock muscle, too clean, too still, the kind of stillness Rennick had seen once already on a man in a gray coat, and he had his hands spread in a show of peace that didn't match the calculation in his eyes. Rennick, Thane said, we need to talk about the girl. She's not for sale, Rennick said, before Thane had finished the sentence, because he already knew with total certainty where this was going. Nobody said sale. There's a recovery fee. Turns out that stock wasn't mine free and clear to give away. Turns out somebody upstream wants her back, and they're paying enough that I'd be a fool not to come ask nicely before they send people who don't ask at all. Thane's eyes cut past Rennick into the shop, to where Vessa stood very still beside the workbench, her hand closing slowly around the nearest heavy tool within reach. You seem like a smart kid. 15 credits was a good deal while it lasted. Take the money I'm offering, walk away clean, and let this be somebody else's problem. How much, Rennick asked, did they offer you to remember which stall she came from? Something flickered in Thane's face, not quite shame. Thane didn't strike Rennick as a man who kept much shame in stock, but something adjacent to it, a flinch at being caught doing the math out loud. More than you're going to make selling scrap for the rest of your life, Thane said. That's not a threat, kid. That's just true. Whoever's paying for her, they don't lose. They never lose. You want to be smart, you hand her over and you go back to being nobody, same as you were a week ago. Rennick looked past him, at the 2 still men in the doorway, and understood that this was the version of the conversation where he was still allowed to say no. There would be another version later, where he wasn't. Get off my yard, Rennick said. Thane held his eyes a long moment, weighing something, and then shrugged, the particular shrug of a man walking away from a bad debt rather than a bad decision. Your funeral, he said, and turned, and the 2 still men turned with him, unhurried, and the 3 of them walked back out into the rain like men who had already gotten everything useful out of the visit, which Rennick would understand within the hour they had. They hadn't come to threaten him. They'd come to confirm the address. Harlan came out from the back the second the bay door slid shut, wrench still in hand, face gone hard in a way Rennick had rarely seen on the old man. That wasn't Doc trouble, Harlan said. That was somebody with real money asking a very expensive question. You understand that, boy? I understand it, Rennick said, and looked at Vessa, who had not moved from beside the workbench, whose hand was still closed white-knuckled around the wrench she'd have used if the 2 still men had come 1 step further into the shop. You should have taken the fee, Vessa said quietly. It would have been the sensible thing. Probably, Rennick agreed. Then why didn't you? He thought about how to answer that honestly, because she'd have known if he lied, even bond severed. She had 3 weeks of watching men lie to her face, and he suspected she'd gotten good at reading it regardless of what her people's gift could or couldn't tell her anymore. Because the sign said free, Rennick said, and I already paid what it actually cost. I'm not selling you twice. Vessa's black eyes held his a long moment, and this time the crack in her composure didn't close back up. It was small, and it didn't last, but for the length of one held breath in a rain-loud salvage shop, Rennick Vale saw something in her face that had nothing to do with wariness and nothing to do with worth, and everything to do with a woman deciding, one careful degree at a time, that she might have been wrong about what this particular stretch of the galaxy had to offer her. They didn't sleep that night. Harlan bolted the bay door with the heavy manual latch he usually reserved for storm season, and the three of them sat in the back office with the lights low, listening to the rain change pitch on the roof, and Rennick understood somewhere around midnight that this wasn't a problem he could outwait. They'll come back with more than 2 men and a broker who talks too much, he said. They will not come themselves, Vessa said. She sat with her knees drawn up again, the old defensive posture, but her eyes were steady on the middle distance, working something out. Dreeth does not send himself for loose ends. He sends men who are good at making loose ends disappear quietly in places without witnesses. The docks are full of witnesses. That is the only reason we are having this conversation, instead of a different one. So we're safe as long as we stay somewhere crowded. We are safer, not safe. There is a difference, and the difference gets smaller every day they know where to look. She turned her head to him, and in the low light her black eyes caught what little there was and held it unreadable. You should let me go, Rennick Vale, not out of cowardice, out of arithmetic. Every hour I am under this roof, the roof is in danger, and you have already given me more dignity than 3 weeks of captivity allowed me to expect from anyone. You do not owe me the rest of your life for it. I didn't buy you, Rennick said low, so I could hand you back to the street the first time it got expensive. That is not what I know what you meant. He held her eyes and made himself say the next part plainly, because he'd learned already that she didn't trust soft words dressed up to sound like something other than what they were. I'm not asking you to stay because I think I can protect you better than you can protect yourself. I'm asking because I don't think either of us gets through this alone, and I'd rather try the hard way with someone than the easy way by myself. That's not charity. That's just true. Vessa was quiet a long moment. Somewhere in the dark of the shop, Harlan pretended very hard to be asleep in his chair, and did a poor job of it. On Ilindra, she said finally, there is a word for what you are describing. It does not translate cleanly. The closest I can give you is chosen kin, not blood, not bond, since I have none left to offer. A person you decide deliberately with open eyes to stand beside regardless of the cost, because the standing itself is the point. Her mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't far from one either. My people used to think it was a lesser thing than bond. A consolation prize for those unlucky enough to lack the sense for the real thing. I am beginning to suspect we had it backward. Chosen kin, Rennick repeated. I can work with that. You should not say it so easily. It is not a small word where I come from. I'm not saying it easily, Rennick said. I'm saying it because I mean it, and it took me 30 seconds to decide because I already knew the answer 4 days ago, standing in the rain in front of Thane's stall. I'm just slow to say things out loud. Ask Harlan. From the corner, without opening his eyes, Harlan said, Boy's been slow to say things out loud since he was 19. Don't take it personal. That got the first real laugh out of Vessa that Rennick had heard, short, startled, more breath than sound, like she'd forgotten the shape her own face made when it happened. It didn't last long. But it happened, and Rennick filed it away the way she filed away exits and doorways, a small hoarded thing he intended to earn again. The plan they built over the next 2 days wasn't a good plan. It was, Harlan pointed out more than once, barely a plan at all. But it had the virtue of being the only one available to 3 people with no army, no court, and a 15-credit release receipt as their only paperwork. Vessa's claim to the Thal line wasn't provable by bond anymore. That was the entire point of what had been done to her, but it wasn't the only proof that had ever existed. Before Dreith's coup, the Thal court had kept a second verification, older than the bond sense tradition, dating back to a century when the Illan still remembered what it was to distrust their own gift. A signet cut from crystal grown in the royal reliquary, keyed to the bloodline by a lattice no forger had ever managed to replicate, worn against the skin from the day of naming. Vessa had worn hers 11 years. Dreith's men, in their thoroughness, had taken nearly everything from her in that windowless room, but a signet worn against the skin for 11 years doesn't look like jewelry to men trained to strip a prisoner of weapons and communications. It looks like nothing. She'd kept it hidden in the seam of her collar the entire time she sat chained to Thane's post, and Rennick hadn't known it existed until the second night, when she pulled it loose from the ruined fabric and set it on the workbench between them, a sliver of crystal the size of a thumbnail, catching the shop light in colors that had no business existing in ordinary spectrum. "That's real," Harlan said, leaning in despite himself, 40 years of hauling half-legal reach cargo giving him at least a rough eye for what counted as genuine. "That's really real. It is the only piece of me Dreith's men did not think to take," Vessa said. "It proves nothing on its own to a court that no longer wants the truth. But there is a magistrate on this station, Illan, old line, exiled here before Dreith's coup for refusing to swear the new oath. If she verifies the lattice publicly, in front of enough witnesses that Dreith's agents on station cannot simply make her disappear too, it becomes a fact that cannot be unsaid. Facts that cannot be unsaid are dangerous to men who built their power on a story. And where do we find an exiled Illan magistrate in a place like this?" Rennick said. That was where Dissa came in. Dissa ran a data stall 2 rows over from Thane's. Technically a repair shop for corrupted memory cores. Actually the best information broker on this stretch of the docks if you knew to ask the right way and pay the right amount. She was human, sharp-eyed, missing half a finger on her left hand from a deal that had gone bad before Rennick had ever met her. And she owed Rennick exactly one favor from the time he'd rewired her stall's cooling system for free during a heat spike that would otherwise have cooked her entire inventory. "You're cashing that favor in for this," Dissa said flatly, once Rennick had laid it out in the back of her stall, voice pitched low under the whir of a dozen scavenged fans. Her eyes cut to Vessa, standing very still near the door, and something in her expression shifted from professional caution to something more careful. "You know who's asking after her, right? Words already moving. Not dock-level word. Off-station money." "We know," Rennick said. Dissa exhaled long and pulled up a cracked data slate from under her counter. "Magistrate Ilrin Kosh. Old line Illan, ran a probate court on Illandra before the coup, refused to swear Dreith's new oath, got exiled here with about 1/10 of her dignity intact. Keeps a legal office 3 levels up in the honest part of the station, such as it is. She still holds standing to verify bloodline claims under the old charter, if anybody bothered to ask her, which nobody has in about 6 years, because everybody assumes an exile's rulings don't mean anything anymore." Dissa's eyes came back to Rennick, sharp. "You want my honest read? Getting a signet in front of Kosh isn't the hard part. The hard part is getting Vessa there alive, because the second Dreith's people confirm which magistrate you're aiming for, that becomes exactly where they concentrate the effort to make sure you never arrive." "Then we don't announce it," Rennick said. "Everything gets announced eventually. That's what off-station money is for." Dissa looked at Vessa again, longer this time, and something changed in her voice, quieter. "For what it's worth, I hope you make it. I've moved a lot of ugly information through this stall over the years. Yours is the first story in a long while. I actually wanted to end well." They left before dawn, the 3 levels up to Kosh's office, a walk Dissa's slate mapped as 11 minutes through the honest part of the station. A stretch of the docks Rennick had visited maybe twice in 3 years, where the corridors were swept and the lighting worked, and nobody was selling anything that had recently belonged to someone else. They made it 4 minutes before the gray coats found them. There were 3 this time, not 2, spread wide across the width of the corridor in a formation that had nothing amateur about it. And Rennick's whole body went cold and clear the way it used to in the half-second before a coil fire caught. That particular stillness where thought outran panic by exactly long enough to be useful. "Behind me," he said to Vesa, low, and she didn't argue, which told him she'd run the same arithmetic he had and reached the same number. Rennick Vale. The lead gray coat said his name like he was reading it off an inventory manifest, flat, unhurried. "You've been an expensive inconvenience for a man who fixes coolant manifolds for a living. Hand her over now, and this ends here on this level with everyone walking away. Make us work for it, and I promise you the ending changes." "She's not stock," Rennick said. "You don't get to hand over what isn't yours to begin with." The gray coat's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "Sentiment," he said, "is the most expensive thing a poor man can afford," and moved. What happened next took 11 seconds, and Rennick would spend a long time afterward reconstructing them slower than they'd actually occurred, the way you do with anything violent and fast. The first gray coat closing distance with a stun baton drawn, Rennick throwing the only weapon he had, a hex driver from his jacket pocket, hard enough into the man's wrist to spoil his grip. The second coming from the side, and Harlan, 60-some years old and 3 steps slower than he'd been 40 years back hauling reach cargo. Catching that one across the shoulder with a pipe wrench, he'd carried the entire walk without a word to anyone, dropping the man to one knee with a crunch that made Rennick's stomach turn even mid-fight. And the third going not for Rennick at all, but around him. Straight for Vesa, because the third one had clearly been briefed that the girl herself was the actual objective, and the humans around her were incidental damage to be stepped past. He never reached her. Vesa moved the way Rennick hadn't seen her move yet. Not the careful, contained stillness of a woman conserving herself, but something fast and precise, and utterly without hesitation, catching the third man's reaching arm and turning her whole body into the motion, using his own weight against the joint the way Rennick recognized, distantly, from half-remembered vids of old Illan Court dueling forms nobody outside the reach had seen in a generation. The man went down hard, breath driven out of him, and Vesa stood over him with her chin up and her black eyes flat and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the wariness she'd worn like armor for the last 4 days. "I was a court-trained heir," she said to him, quiet, precise, each word a small closing door, "before your masters decided I was worthless." Taldreath, his information was incomplete. The lead gray coat, wrist ruined, backed off down the corridor rather than press the math further, and dragged his second man with him, and the third scrambled up and followed, and within 20 seconds the corridor was empty again except for the 3 of them, breathing hard in the honest, well-lit part of the station, and the sound, somewhere above them, of an alarm just beginning to register that a fight had happened on a level where fights weren't supposed to happen. "We have maybe 90 seconds before station security arrives and complicates things in a different direction," Vesa said, already moving. "Kasha's office." "Now." Rennick went, Harlan limping half a step behind, clutching his own shoulder, where the recoil of the wrench swing had wrenched something loose, and none of them looked back, and none of them said out loud the thing all 3 of them now understood without needing to. That whatever Vesa had been reduced to on Thane's stall, whatever the sign had promised the market about her worth, the woman who had just put a trained killer on the ground with her bare hands and her chin still high was not, had never been, nobody. Magistrate Ilran Kasha's office was a narrow room 3 levels up, walls lined with data cases instead of luxury, a single window looking out on the gray underside of the station's upper ring, and Kasha herself was nothing like what Rennick had pictured: small, silver-haired, going white at the temples. Ilan features gone soft and lined with age in a way he hadn't known was possible until he saw it. Dressed in a plain dark robe with none of the ceremony he'd have expected from a woman who'd once run a court. She looked up when they burst in, still breathing hard, and her black eyes went first to Vessa's face, and Rennick watched something in the old woman's composure crack wide open before a single word had been spoken. "Thou," Kosh said very quietly, and came around the desk faster than her age should have allowed, and stopped herself a foot short of Vessa, hands half raised, as if unsure whether the gesture she wanted to make was still hers to offer. "You are, I was told you were dead. Dreeth's office issued a notice 11 days ago, quiet, unofficial, the kind that isn't meant to be believed so much as absorbed." "I am not dead," Vessa said. "I was sold instead. It is, I am told, the more economical option." Kosh's face did something complicated, grief and fury, and something that might have been shame, all at once. The expression of a woman who had spent 6 years in exile believing the fight was already lost, and was now being asked to recalculate everything in the space of a heartbeat. "Show me," Kosh said. Vessa opened her palm. The signet caught the office's dim overhead light, and Kosh bent close over it without touching, murmuring something in Old Court Ilan that Rennick's translator patch rendered only roughly, verification can't. A formal recitation older than the bond sense tradition Dreeth had thought was the only thing worth destroying, and the crystal, under her murmured words, answered. It wasn't dramatic. There was no flash, no glow. It was a small shift in the light passing through the lattice, a resonance only a trained eye would catch, and Kosh's breath went out of her in a long, shaking exhale. "House of Thal," she said, "unbroken lattice. Sworn under old charter, witnessed." She looked up, and there were tears standing in her black eyes that she made no effort to hide, the first open grief Rennick had seen from any Ilan since he'd met Vessa 4 days ago. "Your Highness, forgive an old woman. I did not think I would live to say those words to anyone again." "Don't," Vessa said, and her voice cracked just slightly, the first real crack Rennick had heard in it since the market, not composure breaking under fear this time, but under something closer to grief of her own. 6 years of a title she'd been raised to, and 3 weeks of being told it was worth nothing, all colliding at once in one small office. "Please, not yet. Not until it means something more than a woman crying in a room 3 people will ever know about." "It will mean more," Kosh said, steadying herself, old authority coming back into her spine like a garment she hadn't worn in years but hadn't forgotten how to carry. "I still hold standing under the old charter to verify bloodline before witnesses. I have not exercised it in 6 years because no one has asked, and because I believe there was no one left worth asking for. That has changed in the last 5 minutes. Give me until tomorrow. I will call every old line witness left on this station who still owes the House of Thal a debt of honor rather than a debt of fear, and we will do this properly, in a room Dreeth's people cannot simply walk into and erase." "Tomorrow may not exist," Rennick said. 3 of Dreeth's men found us in the honest levels 40 minutes ago. If they know we came here, they will assume you came seeking passage off station, not verification," Kosh said. "It is the more obvious read, and Dreeth's people, for all their resources, have grown lazy trusting the obvious read. It has kept me alive 6 years. It will buy us 1 night." She looked between the 3 of them, weighing something, and her eyes settled on Rennick a beat longer than Vessa's, a question in them Rennick didn't fully understand until she asked it. "And who are you, to have carried a lost Thal heir through 3 gray coats and station security to my door?" "Nobody important," Rennick said. "I fix coolant manifolds." "He is chosen kin," Vessa said, before Rennick could deflect further, and something in the way she said it, steady, unembarrassed, offering the phrase up like a fact rather than a confession, made Kosh's gaze sharpen with fresh interest, and made the back of Rennick's neck go warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fight 40 minutes ago. "Then you are more important than you think, coolant manifold man," Kosh said, "because a Thal heir does not use that word lightly, and I have never once heard it offered to a human in 50 years of court record. She turned briskly, already reaching for her data slate, old authority fully restored now, all business. Go, somewhere with walls and a lock you trust. I will send word through a channel Dreith's people have never managed to compromise. And tomorrow, at the 10th hour, we do this in front of every honest witness left in this ring. They didn't go back to the shop. Harlan insisted on it, over Rennick's objection, in the flat, immovable way the old man reserved for arguments he considered already settled. The shop's address was compromised the moment Thane's information reached Dreith's people, and returning to it now, the night before the one meeting that mattered, was exactly the kind of obvious move Kosh had just warned them against making. Instead, they took a room above a noodle stall Harlan had known the owner of for 20 years. Cash paid, no names given. 3 cots crammed into a space meant for one. And Rennick sat by the single-shuttered window with a length of pipe across his knees, while Harlan's breathing evened into something like sleep, and Vesa sat wide awake on the cot across from him, the signet held loose in one hand, turning it slowly in the dim light filtering through the shutter slats. "You didn't have to say that," Rennick said, eventually, low so as not to wake Harlan, "to Kosh, about chosen kin." "I did not have to," Vesa agreed. "I chose to. There is a difference, and I would think by now you understood it was the entire point of the word." "I'm not royalty," he said. "Tomorrow you're going to stand in front of a room full of your own people and become something I don't have a word for. I fix coolant manifolds. That's not, I don't know what that makes me, once you're not sitting on a tarp in a scrap yard anymore." Vesa was quiet a moment, turning the signet over once more, watching the light shift through it. "On Ilindra," she said, "before the coup, there was an old law, older even than the signet tradition, that no reigning Thal was required to marry within the bond caste, or within the nobility, or within our own species at all. Only that she marry with open eyes, having seen the person clearly, without the sense to disguise what she was choosing. It was written for exactly the situation I am currently in, though I doubt the lawmakers who drafted it 4 centuries ago pictured a scrapyard mechanic from a border station." Her black eyes came up to his, steady, unflinching, none of the market stall wariness left in them at all now. "I do not know yet what tomorrow makes of me. Queen, exile, target, curiosity, I have been all 4 in the space of 1 month, and I have stopped assuming I know which one comes next. But I know what 4 days with you have already made of the woman Thane's sign called worthless, and I do not intend to let a crown, if I am given one back, decide that I have to set that down to hold it." Rennick didn't have an answer that felt big enough for that, so he didn't reach for one. He crossed the small room instead, quietly enough not to wake Harlan, and sat on the edge of her cot, close but not touching, giving her the same choice he'd offered outside Thane's stall 4 days ago, palm open, decision hers. Vesa looked at his offered hand for a long moment, the way she had that first day. Then she set the signet down on the blanket between them, and put her hand in his, fingers lacing through his careful and deliberate, and Rennick understood, sitting in a rented room above a noodle stall with a length of pipe forgotten across his knees, that whatever happened tomorrow, this particular fact was already true, and was not going to become less true no matter what title got attached to her name by morning. Neither of them slept much, neither of them minded. Morning came gray and wet, same as every morning on the docks, and Rennick woke to the smell of noodle broth drifting up through the floorboards and Vesa already dressed, already sitting by the window, the signet on its cord around her neck now instead of hidden in a seam, worn openly for the first time since Dreith's men had taken it from her sight 3 weeks ago. "You look different," Rennick said. "I feel different," Vesa said. "I am not certain yet if that is a good thing." Harlan's shoulder had stiffened up ugly overnight, purple-black bruising down to the elbow, where the wrench swing had wrenched something loose, and he waved off both their concern with the particular stubbornness of a man who decided a long time ago that pain was a private matter. "I've had worse off a bad coupling failure," he said. "Don't fuss. Get the girl to her court, that's the job today." They left the room before the 10th hour, taking Dissaz's mapped route rather than the honest level's main corridor, cutting instead through a maintenance crawl that ran beneath the ring's public concourse. Narrower, uglier, smelling of standing water and old rust, but empty, which mattered more than comfort this morning. They made it 2/3 of the way before the crawl dead-ended into a service junction, and the man waiting there wasn't wearing a gray coat at all. He wore a dark formal uniform, illing cut, silver rank markings at the collar, and he stood with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in his career needed to raise his own voice to get what he wanted. 2 gray coats flanked him, and behind them, further back in the shadow of the junction, 4 more, enough that Rennick's earlier arithmetic about crowded corridors and witnesses collapsed instantly. This was a dead-end service junction under a public concourse, and nobody was coming to interrupt anything down here. "Colonel Vasek Orr," the uniformed man said, by way of introduction, as though the courtesy of a name mattered more than the 6 armed men behind him. "Regent Dreith's Director of Continuity. I apologize for the venue. I was hoping to have this conversation somewhere with better lighting, but Your Highness has proven difficult to schedule." His eyes moved to Vesa, and there was nothing in them that Rennick could call respect, only cold professional interest, the look of a man assessing an asset rather than a person. "You should not have gone to Kosh. It complicates what was, until yesterday, a very simple problem." "You mean it complicates the lie," Vesa said. "That I was already dead. That is the version of continuity you were counting on, isn't it, Colonel? Not my death exactly, only my quiet erasure into a rumor nobody bothers to disprove." "The Regent does not require your death," Orr said. "He requires your silence. He would prefer it come by your own choice, a quiet passage off system, a new name, resources enough to live comfortably somewhere. Dreith's continuity is not your concern. He authorized me to offer it generously, one final time, before this becomes a matter I am required to resolve less generously." His eyes flicked to Rennick, dismissive, cataloging him the same clinical way Ossik Thane had, the same way that made Rennick's jaw tighten. "The mechanic may even be permitted to accompany you, if that sweetens the arithmetic." "He has a name," Vesa said cold. "Say it or do not speak of him at all." Orr's eyebrow rose a fraction, the first genuine reaction Rennick had gotten out of him, and something in it looked almost like curiosity, a data point he hadn't accounted for in his briefing. "Interesting," Orr said. "The reports characterized you as broken, bond severed, without recourse, without value. I confess I expected less fire from what the Regent's office filed as scrap." His gaze returned to Vesa fully now, and the professional courtesy dropped an inch, replaced by something flatter and more dangerous. "Regardless, the offer stands for exactly as long as it takes you to decide, and no longer. Kosh's little verification ceremony does not happen today." "That is not a request." "It happens today," Vesa said, "because you no longer have the numbers to stop it quietly, Colonel, and a loud stop is precisely the outcome your Regent cannot survive politically. You did not bring 6 men to kill me. You brought 6 men to frighten me into choosing exile on my own, because a coerced disappearance still requires my silence afterward, and dead women do not stay silent nearly as conveniently as living ones you can threaten again next month." Her chin was up, her voice hadn't wavered once, and Rennick, standing half a step behind her in a rusted service junction with a length of pipe still in his hand, felt something in his chest that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite fear, but sat close enough to both that he couldn't fully separate them. "Tell your Regent I decline his generosity. Tell him I intend to stand in front of Magistrate Kosh within the hour, and that every additional man he sends to stop it only confirms, more loudly, exactly how frightened he is of one bond-severed woman he was told was worthless." For a long moment, nobody in the junction moved. Then Orr's mouth thinned, some private calculation resolving behind his eyes, and he inclined his head a fraction, not a bow, nothing so generous but an acknowledgment. "Take her," Orr said to the men behind him, and the junction erupted. It was worse than the corridor fight the day before, 6 men instead of 3. A confined space with no room to maneuver, and Rennick's first coherent thought in the chaos was that they were not going to walk out of this the way they'd walked out of the last one. He got the pipe up in time to turn aside a baton strike aimed at his skull, felt the impact shudder up through his forearms hard enough to numb them, and then Harlan was there beside him despite the ruined shoulder, using his good arm and 40 years of dogfight memory to put a second man into the junction's rusted wall hard enough to drop him. Vesa fought the way she had the day before, precise, economical, using her attackers' own momentum against them rather than matching their strength. But 6 was more than 3, and Rennick watched, with a cold drop in his stomach, a fourth man get an arm around her from behind while she was occupied with a third, and knew in the half-second before it happened that this was the moment the whole plan came apart. It didn't happen the way he expected. Orr himself stepped forward at the last second, not to help subdue her, but between her and the man dragging her back, one raised hand, a single sharp word in Old Court Illan that made his own men freeze mid-motion. "Enough," Orr said, and in the sudden stillness his voice had lost every trace of the cold professional courtesy from a moment ago. He looked at Vesa, breathing hard, signet swinging loose against her collar where it had come free in the fight, and something in his face had changed, not softened, not exactly, but shifted, recalculated. "You held a verification lattice to a room of witnesses the regent cannot touch without confirming publicly that he feared it. You quoted continuity law back at me correctly, unprompted, a law even I had to look up before this assignment, and you just watched 4 of my men fail to take you quietly in a junction built for exactly that purpose." His jaw worked. "I have served 3 regents in my career, Highness. I know the sound of a claim that is actually true, and the sound of one that only wishes it were. Yours has been the first that was true in 6 years. "Then let us pass," Vesa said, still breathing hard, still standing. The fourth man's grip loosened enough now that she'd twisted free of it entirely. Orr looked at her a long moment, then at Rennick, bruised and bleeding from a cut over one eyebrow he hadn't noticed happening, then at Harlan, gripping his ruined shoulder, refusing to show it. "The regent will have my rank for this," Orr said quietly, more to himself than to any of them. "But I did not swear my oath to a man who sells princesses on scrap market stalls and calls it continuity." He stepped back and made a short gesture to his remaining men, and after a beat of visible confusion, they lowered their weapons and stepped back with him. "Go, Highness. Quickly, before I finish thinking this through and change my mind out of simple self-preservation." Vesa held his gaze a moment longer, some old court weight passing between them that Rennick didn't have the context to fully read, and then inclined her head 1 degree, queen to soldier. "I will remember this, Colonel," she said. "Whatever happens next." They ran the rest of the way to Kosh's office, bruised and bleeding and short 2 of Orr's men who peeled off to follow at a distance that felt less like pursuit now than escort, and arrived at the 10th hour with 4 minutes to spare, to find the narrow office had been quietly transformed overnight. A dozen chairs crowded in around the data cases, a dozen Illan faces old enough to remember the House of Thal before the coup. Exiles and merchants and 1 retired ship's captain who'd flown royal transport in a life 6 years gone, all of them turning as one when the door opened and Vesa stepped through it, bloodied and rain-soaked and utterly unmistakable. The room went completely silent. Kosh rose from behind her desk, old ceremony settling over her like a garment finally fitted right, and lifted her voice to fill the small, crowded room. "Witnesses," she said, "I call this verification under the old charter, unbroken since the founding of the House of Thal, before this gathered assembly in the presence of the last living heir." Her eyes found Vesa's, and something in them was fierce now, joyful, 6 years of exile burning off her like fog. "Come forward, Highness. Let them see." Vesa crossed the small room, past a dozen faces Rennick didn't know and one, Ilrin Kosh, who mattered more in this moment than any of them, and held out the signet on its cord. And Kosh spoke the verification cant a second time, slower now, formal, meant to be witnessed rather than rushed. And the crystal answered the same small resonant shift it had the night before, this time in front of 12 people who had spent 6 years believing there was no House of Thal left to verify anything at all. One by one, they rose from their chairs. The old ship's captain went first, dropping to one knee with a grunt of complaint from joints that hadn't knelt to anyone in years, and the gesture rippled outward, chair by chair, until every Ilin in the room stood or knelt in the old formal posture Rennick had no name for but understood instantly anyway. Heads bowed to a woman who 4 days ago had been sitting chained to a market post with a sign over her head declaring her worth nothing at all. Vesa stood very still in the center of it, and Rennick, watching from the doorway where he'd stopped rather than intrude on something that wasn't his to stand inside, saw her composure, the same iron composure she'd worn through Thane's stall, and the gray coats and oars junction finally, completely break. Not into weeping, not into collapse, into something quieter and harder to fake, her hand rising slow to press against her own mouth, eyes bright and wet and disbelieving, a woman who had spent 3 weeks being told by every voice around her that she was worth exactly nothing, standing in a room full of people telling her, without a single word, that they had never once stopped believing otherwise. "Rise," Vesa said finally, voice rough, and the room rose. "Please, all of you. I do not—" She stopped, gathered herself, and Rennick watched her do it, watched the effort it cost her, and loved her for the fact that she did it anyway rather than let the moment perform something less true. "I was told 4 days ago by a man selling scrap on a market row that I was nobody's to want. I would like it recorded, for whatever this witnessing is worth going forward, that he was wrong, and that I did not learn it from any of you. I learned it first from a man who is not in this room by blood or bond or old charter law, who paid 15 credits for something a broker called worthless, and who has not once since then treated me as anything less than exactly what this room has just confirmed I always was." Her eyes found Rennick's across the crowded office, held there, steady. "Come here, Rennick Vale. You have earned the right to stand inside this, not outside it." Rennick crossed the room slowly, aware of a dozen old Ilin eyes on him, aware of how little he belonged in a room like this by any measure, except the one that had apparently just been declared to matter most, and stood beside her. And Kosh looked between the two of them with an expression that was half formal magistrate and half a woman who hadn't smiled this wide in 6 years. "The verification is entered," Kosh said. "Witnessed, recorded, unbreakable under old charter. Whatever comes next, and I do not think Dreeth will accept this quietly, the fact of it cannot be erased again. You are Thal. You are heir. And you have arrived at this room having already chosen, before your throne was ever restored to you, exactly the kind of queen you intend to be." It should have felt like an ending. Rennick understood, standing there with blood drying over one eyebrow and Vesa's hand finding his without either of them announcing the gesture to the room, that it was instead only the end of the opening move, because a verified claim in an exile's office 3 levels up from a scrap market was a fact, now unerasable, exactly as Kosh had promised. But Corvin Dreeth still held the throne on Ilindra, still commanded fleets and courts and continuity offices 400 light years from this room, and a fact that inconvenient did not simply sit quietly waiting to be accepted. It demanded an answer. And Rennick understood, watching the old ship's captain already murmuring urgently to Kosh about secure channels and how fast word would travel once Orr's failure reached the Regent's office, that the answer was going to come looking for them, and soon. Word moved fast after that. Kosh's office had no windows facing the concourse, but within 2 hours, a runner boy trusted brought news that station security had opened an inquiry into the junction fight, that Colonel Vasek Orr had not reported back to whatever relay he answered to, and that the docks, the whole grubby, indifferent 1,000 tragedies-a-day stretch of Market Row where nobody had blinked at a chained woman under a hand-painted sign 4 days ago, were now talking of nothing else. "That is the danger now," Kosh said, pacing the narrow width of her office while the old ship's captain worked a secure channel in the corner. "Not another junction ambush. Dreeth cannot afford to keep failing quietly. Every failed attempt makes the story louder, and the story is now loud enough that he either answers it publicly, in a way that risks looking weak, or he escalates past quiet entirely and sends something this station cannot pretend not to notice." "How much can he actually escalate?" Rennick asked. "Against one exile's office on a border station he doesn't govern." "Ilindra is 11 hours by fast courier from this ring," the ship's captain said without looking up from his channel work, gruff, gravel-voiced, the kind of man who'd clearly spent a long career not being impressed by much. "Dreeth keeps a standing readiness wing at the capital, specifically for continuity matters he decides are urgent. If he judges this one urgent, and boy, after Orr's silence, I judge it urgent in his boots, he can have an armed cutter in this system inside a day. Maybe less." The room went quiet at that, the particular quiet of people recalculating a timeline they'd assumed was measured in days suddenly compressed into hours. "Then we don't wait for him to decide how urgent it is," Vesa said. She'd cleaned the blood from her eyebrow-cut cousin Gash. Rennick's, not her own. She'd fussed over it with a field kit from Kosh's cabinet with a brisk competence that suggested court-trained heirs learned field medicine along with dueling forms. And something in her voice now had shifted register entirely from the raw grief of the verification ceremony into something colder, sharper, the voice, Rennick understood, of a woman remembering exactly how to think like the leader 6 years of exile had never quite managed to erase from her. "We force the story into the open before he can control its shape. Magistrate, does the old charter grant any standing to broadcast a verified claim publicly, station-wide, without waiting for Dreeth's office to acknowledge it first?" Kosh stopped pacing. "It does. It has not been invoked in over a century. No verified Thal claim has needed the protection since before my grandmother's time, but the mechanism exists. A public reading before any assembly willing to host it, entered into station record independent of Ilindra's own courts. Once broadcast, Dreeth cannot simply erase it through a relay blackout or a bought magistrate. Too many independent copies exist the moment it airs." "Then that is what we do," Vesa said. "Today, before his cutter arrives and makes the question moot by force instead of law." "That's a public event," Rennick said. "Announced, scheduled, exactly the kind of target Orr's men were trying to avoid handing him in that junction. You'd be putting yourself in the open on purpose." "I have been in the open since the moment I refused Orr's offer of quiet exile," Vesa said, and there was no fear in it. Only the flat clarity of a woman who had already run every version of this arithmetic and arrived at the only answer that didn't end in disappearing. "The alternative is hiding in exiles' offices and rented rooms above noodle stalls for the rest of my life, hoping Dreeth loses interest before he loses patience. He will not lose interest. Regents who murder inconveniently do not retire quietly. I would rather stand in the open, on my own terms, in front of witnesses who cannot be quietly erased, than spend the next 6 years the way Kosh has spent the last 6, alive, and unable to prove it matters." Kosh's eyes were wet again briefly, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to add to that. "Then we do it right," Rennick said, "not just Kosh's office, somewhere bigger. Somewhere with enough of the docks watching that Dreeth's people can't scrub the record even if they get there before nightfall." Desaf found them the venue within the hour, the dock's old assembly hall, a cavernous echoing structure built 2 generations back for shipping guild meetings, and now used mostly for storage and the occasional unlicensed fight ring. But still, on paper, a public gathering space that couldn't legally be closed to a registered station broadcast without a magistrate's order. And Kosh still held enough standing, barely, exiled or not, to issue exactly that order in her own name. Word went out through channels Rennick hadn't known existed until that afternoon. Dissaz data stall network, the ship captain's old crew contacts, a dozen exiled Ilan Kosh had quietly kept faith with through 6 lean years, even strangely, a runner who arrived breathless with a message from Osik Thane himself. 3 words scrawled on a torn receipt. "I'll be there." "Thane," Rennick said, reading it twice like it might change on a second look. "Thane wants to show up." "Guilt does strange things to men who have spent their lives pretending they don't have any," Harlan said, arm in a sling now, courtesy of Kosh's field kit, but upright and stubborn as ever. "Or he wants to be seen backing the winning side before it's obvious who that is. Either way, boy, take the bodies you're offered today. We're not exactly drowning in allies." By the time the assembly hall's doors opened at dusk, the docks had done what the docks always did with a rumor loud enough, turned it into an event. Word had it wrong in a dozen directions, embellished past recognition by the time it reached the back rows, but the shape of it had stuck true enough. The broken Ilan stock from Thane's stall wasn't broken at all, was somebody, was maybe royalty, and the mechanic who'd bought her free was standing beside her when the somebody got proven true. 200 people packed into a hall built for guild meetings, market vendors and scrap crews and off-shift dock workers standing shoulder to shoulder with the dozen old-line Ilan exiles Kosh had gathered that morning. And Rennick stood at the edge of the small raised platform at the hall's center, watching Vesa walk out into the light of it, and understood that whatever this was about to become, there was no version of tonight where they could still choose to disappear quietly. Kosh spoke first, her voice carrying with an authority Rennick hadn't heard from her in the cramped office that morning, the formal cant of the verification ringing out clean and unhurried across the packed hall, translated in real time by a station relay for the human half of the crowd who'd never heard Old Court Ilan in their lives. The signet came out again, held high this time instead of hidden in a collar seam, and the crystal answered the cant the same small resonant way it had twice before, and this time the station's own recording relays caught every second of it, broadcasting live across every public channel the docks maintained, unerasable the instant it left the hall. The crowd did not kneel, not most of them. Dock workers and scrap crews weren't Old Court Ilan, didn't carry 6 centuries of ceremony in their knees. But something moved through the packed hall regardless, a ripple of recognition that had nothing to do with bloodline law and everything to do with 200 people who'd walked past that market stall themselves in the last 4 days, who'd seen the sign, who'd made their own small private judgment about a woman worth nothing, and were now watching that judgment get publicly, permanently, undeniably corrected. "I know what most of you saw 4 days ago," Vesa said into the hall's stillness, her voice picked up and carried by the relay to every corner of the station listening. "A collar, a sign, a verdict about my worth, written by a man who profits from believing worth and usefulness are the same measurement. I will not pretend the verdict was wrong about the fact underneath it. I am bond severed. I will very likely remain so for the rest of my life. By the only standard my own people have used to value an Ilan woman for 400 years, the sign was accurate." She let that sit a moment, and Rennick watched 200 faces lean into the silence of it. "But I have learned something in 4 days that 6 years of court law never taught me, which is that a standard which discards a person the moment she stops being useful was never a measurement of worth to begin with. It was a measurement of convenience. And I intend, if this claim stands, to spend whatever throne I am given rewriting that particular convenience out of thou law permanently, so that no Ilan woman after me is ever again reduced to a sign on a market stall, because some usurper found her inconvenient to keep whole." The hall didn't erupt into cheering. It wasn't that kind of crowd, and this wasn't that kind of speech, but something shifted in the quality of the silence, attentive now instead of merely curious, and Rennick, watching from the platform's edge, saw Ossip Thane standing near the back, arms crossed, face unreadable, and understood that whatever guilt had brought him here, the woman speaking now was making it considerably harder for him to leave without reckoning with it. It was in the middle of that silence, with the broadcast still live across every relay on the station, that the alarms began. They weren't Dreith's alarms. That was the first thing Rennick understood as the hall's ambient lighting cut to hazard amber, and the low klaxon rolled across the packed crowd. These were the station's own collision alarms, the ones that meant something large and unscheduled had just translated into local space too fast and too close to the ring for comfort. And 200 people who moments ago had been listening to a queen's speech now surged toward the exits in the particular controlled panic of people who worked in shipping and knew exactly how bad an unscheduled translation that close could be. "That's not station traffic," the old ship's captain said, already moving toward the platform, voice pitched to cut through the noise. "That's a hard burn-in system. Somebody wanted to arrive faster than safe protocol allows, which means somebody wanted to arrive before word of tonight finished spreading." "Dreith," Vesa said, and there was no surprise in it, only a grim confirmation of arithmetic she'd clearly already run. He did not wait for a diplomatic answer. He came to end the question himself. The hall's relay screens, still broadcasting live, flickered and cut to a station traffic feed instead. A single armed cutter, sleek and dark and unmistakably military grade, decelerating hard on approach to the ring's primary docking spar, running lights the deep crimson of Ilandra's continuity office rather than any merchant registry. Rennick had never seen an actual warship before, not up close, not real the docks dealt in scrap and salvage, not frontline hardware, and something cold settled low in his stomach at the sight of it, sleek and purposeful and entirely out of scale with everything else in his life up to this point. "He's not supposed to have jurisdiction here," Rennick said. "This is a neutral station." "Jurisdiction is a word men respect right up until the moment they decide it's inconvenient," Kosh said, already herding the nearest exiles toward a side exit with brisk, practiced urgency. "A single cutter cannot invade a neutral ring outright. Station defense grid would tear it apart before it cleared the outer marker, and even Dreith is not so far gone as to start an interstellar incident over one air. But he does not need an invasion. He needs one door, one hallway, 5 minutes alone with her before enough witnesses can gather to stop it. That is what the cutter is for. Everything else is theater." "Then we don't give him 5 minutes alone with anything," Rennick said. Station security arrived at the hall within minutes, uniformed officers pushing through the dispersing crowd with weapons drawn but no clear target, and it was Dessa, of all people, who cut through the confusion first, vaulting onto the platform with her cracked data slate held high. Broadcasting the live traffic feed of the cutter's approach directly into the station's public safety channel, loud enough for the responding officers to hear it themselves. "That ship just ran a hazard translation inside collision minimums to reach a docking spar during a broadcast verification event that 200 witnesses just watched live," Dessass shouted, sharp and fast, the practiced cadence of someone who'd spent a career making complicated information land in someone else's head in under 10 seconds. "You want a reason to hold it at the spar and board it for a safety violation before it ever reaches the concourse. I just handed you one, recorded, station relay, can't be disputed. Use it." The ranking security officer, a heavy-set woman with a captain's bar and the harried expression of someone whose shift had just gone very wrong very fast, looked at the feed, looked at the crowd, looked at Vesa standing on the platform with the signet still bright against her collar, and made her decision in under 5 seconds, the particular fast decisiveness of someone who'd rather be right and fired than slow and blamed. "Hold that cutter at the spar," she said into her comm, already moving. "Safety violation, full boarding inspection, nobody disembarks until my people clear it." and get me a secure line to the ring governor's office. I want this on record as a neutral territory incident before whoever's aboard that ship starts making calls of their own. It bought them time. It did not buy them safety, and Rennick understood that clearly enough watching Vessa's face as the platform emptied around them. Dreeth might be held at the docking spar for the next hour arguing jurisdiction with a security captain who owed him nothing. But a man who commanded fleets and continuity offices 400 light-years away had other tools than the ship he'd arrived on, and the crowd of witnesses that had protected them inside the hall was already thinning into the night. Back to their stalls and their shifts and their ordinary indifferent lives, the way crowds always eventually did. "We need somewhere he genuinely cannot follow," Kosh said, already moving toward the side exit with the last of the old line exiles. "Not another rented room. Somewhere with standing that outranks a continuity office's reach entirely." "The ring governor's own chambers," the ship's captain said. "Neutral territory's neutral territory, but the governor's office carries treaty weight. Dreeth can't simply override with a security captain's patience. Get her in front of the governor directly, with the broadcast already on permanent record, and Dreeth's 5 minutes alone become considerably harder to find no matter how many cutters he burns fuel bringing in system." They moved fast through backstreets Desan knew better than anyone, the dock's evening crowd thinning around them into the particular hush that fell over the market rows after dark. Stalls shuttered, neon buzzing over empty walkways, and Rennick kept himself half a step ahead of Vessa the whole way without either of them discussing it. Old instinct now rather than decision. The same instinct that had made him stop in front of Thane's stall 6 days ago instead of walking past. They were 3 streets from the governor's tower when Thane found them. He came out of a side alley fast enough that Rennick's whole body went tight and ready before recognizing the shape of him, and Thane threw both hands up immediately, empty, no weapon, breathing hard like he'd been running. "Easy," Thane said. "I'm not here to sell you twice, kid, I promise you that much." He looked at Vessa, and something in his heavy, unlovely face was doing genuine work, an emotion Rennick hadn't credited him with the capacity for back on the market row. "I came to tell you Dreeth's people didn't wait on the cutter alone. There's a second crew, groundside, been sitting quiet in a rented berth 2 streets over from my stall since yesterday morning. Hired local muscle, not continuity office regulars, which means they're not bound by whatever restraint your governor's treaty is putting on the cutter. I found out an hour ago because they came asking me, again, whether I remembered which shop the broken stock walked into. I told them I didn't remember a damn thing." He swallowed hard, and Rennick watched a man who'd spent his whole life on the docks pricing everything try, badly, to put a debt he owed into words. "I sold her like she was scrap, on a sign I wrote myself because it was faster than doing the paperwork right. I've been telling myself for 6 days that wasn't my business to think twice about. Figured the least I owed, for that was a warning before it got somebody killed." "Where?" Vessa said, no anger in it, only urgency. 2 streets over. They'll have moved the second they clocked the governor's tower as your likely destination, which, if I found this out an hour ago, they've had it longer." Thane's eyes cut past her, down the street toward the tower's lit spire, calculating the same distance Rennick was calculating. "You've got maybe 4 minutes before they're between you and that door if they haven't already closed it." Kosh's face had gone pale. 4 minutes is not enough distance to root around them safely. "Then we don't root around them," Rennick said. "We go straight through fast before they finish setting up. 4 minutes cuts both ways. It's not enough time for them to be perfectly ready either." Vessa looked at him, and something passed between them that didn't need translation cant or bond sense or 6 centuries of court law to carry its meaning, and she nodded once. The decision already made the way it always seemed to be made between them now, together, fast, without wasted words. "Then we run," she said. They didn't make it clean. The hired crew hit them a block and a half short of the tower's plaza, spilling out of a parked cargo hauler with the loose, aggressive confidence of local muscle, rather than trained continuity soldiers. 6 of them. Mismatched armor, stun weapons, and at least one real firearm. Rennick clocked with a cold lurch the moment the man carrying it raised it. And there was no formation to break through this time. No colonel or weighing continuity law against his own conscience. Just 6 men paid to stop a woman from reaching a door, and no reason at all to be gentle about it. "Down!" Rennick shouted and grabbed Vessa's shoulder, hauling her sideways behind a row of parked cargo drones a half-second before the firearm discharged, the round sparking off Ferrocrete where she'd been standing, and every calm, controlled version of tonight's plan evaporated at once into the flat animal urgency of not dying in the next 30 seconds. Harlan, one arm still slung, put himself bodily between the drones and the nearest attacker with nothing but a scavenged pipe wrench and 40 years of dogfight stubbornness, and took a stun baton strike across the ribs for it that dropped him hard to one knee with a sound that made Rennick's chest go tight with fear that had nothing to do with his own safety. Dessau was already moving the opposite direction, slate held high, broadcasting the ambush live to the same public safety channel that had held the cutter, screaming coordinates into it loud enough to carry over the chaos. Kosh pulled 2 of the older exiles back into a doorway alcove, shielding them with her own body despite her age, despite everything. Rennick didn't have a weapon beyond the pipe he'd carried since the junction fight, and he used it anyway, catching a stun baton mid-swing hard enough to numb his own arm to the elbow, driving his shoulder into the man behind it and putting him down onto the wet Ferrocrete. And it wasn't skill. He understood dimly even as he did it. It was only the desperate, ugly momentum of a man who had already decided, 6 days ago outside a market stall, exactly how far he was willing to go rather than watch her get taken again. Vessa fought beside him, precise even now, even scared. He could see the fear in her. Finally, real fear instead of the flat court-trained composure she'd worn through every threat so far. Because this was different. This was Rennick and Harlan and Dessau and Kosh in the blast radius with her rather than herself alone. And that fear made her faster rather than slower, sharper. A woman who had run out of patience for arithmetic and switched entirely to instinct. It was the firearm that turned it. The man carrying it lined up a second shot. Clean. No drone or body between him and Vessa this time. And Rennick didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't run any of the careful arithmetic that had gotten them this far. He simply moved, putting his own body into the line the round would take, because some decisions aren't decisions at all, just the plain shape of who you already are arriving a half-second ahead of your thoughts. The shot caught him high in the shoulder, a white detonation of pain that dropped him hard onto the wet Ferrocrete, and the last thing he heard clearly before the world narrowed down to a roaring white edge was Vessa's voice, no longer composed at all, screaming his name in a register he'd never heard from her, raw and human despite everything alien about her. And then the sound of station security finally arriving in force, drawn by Dessau's broadcast. Boots and shouted commands, and the hired crew scattering into the dark, rather than face a real fight against real numbers. He came back to himself in pieces, the wet Ferrocrete cold against his cheek, the taste of copper, Vessa's hands pressed hard against his shoulder, her voice close and shaking and using words he didn't have the translator patch bandwidth left to parse. Old Court Illin, urgent, private, not meant for the crowd gathering around them. "Stay," she said in common now, catching his eyes, holding them, her own black eyes wet and wide and utterly without composure for the first time since the market stall. "Stay with me, Rennick Vale. You do not get to do this, and then leave before I have said the things I still owe you." "Not going anywhere," he managed, which came out slurred and stupid and made her laugh despite everything, a short broken sound closer to a sob than a laugh, and she pressed her forehead to his for one long moment. Not a kiss, nothing that crossed the line either of them had held carefully between dignity and something more since the first night in the shop, just the simple animal comfort of one heartbeat close against another. before the medics arrived and pulled her gently back to let them work. He woke properly some hours later in a clean, quiet room that smelled nothing like the docks, all soft light and hushed machine hum, his shoulder wrapped tight, and aching under a field of dull, distant pain that told him someone had been generous with the anesthetic. Vesa sat in the chair beside the bed, still in the same rain and blood-stained clothes from the assembly hall, refusing, he'd learn later, every offer to leave his side even for a change of clothes or a proper meal. "You're an idiot," she said, the moment his eyes opened, though her voice cracked on it in a way that undercut the accusation considerably. "Probably," Rennick agreed. "You stepped in front of a firearm for me. You'd have done the same for me. You already did twice before this. That is not the same arithmetic, and you know it." But she was crying now, quietly, without the careful composure she'd guarded through everything else, tears actually falling for the first time since he'd met her, and Rennick understood that this, not the market stall, not the verification ceremony, not even the room full of kneeling exiles, was the moment her armor had finally, completely come down. "I have been someone's daughter and someone's heir and someone's political inconvenience and someone's broken stock on a market row. I have not, in a very long time, been someone a person was willing to bleed for simply because they could not stand to watch me hurt instead. I do not know what to do with that. I am not certain my own people ever taught me the shape of it." "You don't have to do anything with it," Rennick said, reaching for her hand with the arm that still worked, and she let him take it, gripping back hard enough that he understood exactly how frightened she'd actually been. "You just have to let it be true." She was quiet a long moment, thumb moving slow over his knuckles, and outside the window, he could see it now. Turning his head, the dock's familiar gray rain had given way to something clearer, the ring's artificial dawn cycle beginning its slow climb toward daylight. "Dreith's cutter was released from the docking spar 4 hours ago," Vesa said finally, quieter, the practical weight of it settling back over her like a garment she couldn't set down for long even now. "Held for safety inspection just long enough for the ambush crew's connection to him to become undeniable on record," Dissaz broadcast, the security captain's own report, the timing too precise to be coincidence. "The ring governor has formally summoned him to answer for it in front of a neutral tribunal before he is permitted to leave system. He cannot simply burn out system and pretend tonight did not happen. Too many witnesses. Too much of it broadcast live and permanent." Her jaw set, old court steel coming back into it even through the exhaustion, and the tears not yet fully dried. "He will come to answer it, Rennick, because refusing to answer it publicly damages his continuity claim almost as badly as answering it honestly would. And when he comes, I intend to be standing in that tribunal room, on my own 2 feet, with every fact this station cannot unknow already entered into permanent record." When Rennick said, "Tomorrow," Vesa said, "which gives you exactly 1 day to heal enough to stand beside me for it, because I am not walking into that room without you again. Not after tonight. I have run the arithmetic, and I have decided I do not particularly care what it costs me politically to admit, in front of the man who tried to erase me, that I would rather have you in the room than every crown my ancestors ever wore." Rennick didn't have a clever answer for that either. He just held her hand, and let the ring's slow artificial dawn fill the quiet room, and understood that whatever happened in that tribunal tomorrow, the actual verdict that mattered, the one about what she was worth, and to whom had already, somewhere in the last 6 days, been decided and could not now be undone by any court on any world. The tribunal convened the following evening in the ring governor's own chamber, a room built for exactly this kind of neutral arbitration. High-ceilinged, unadorned, no throne or dais to favor any party, only a long curved table where the governor sat flanked by 2 treaty officers, an open floor space on either side for the parties to stand as equals before the record. Rennick's shoulder was strapped tight under his shirt, movement still limited, pain kept at a manageable distance by the last of the medic's patients. But he stood anyway, upright, at Vessa's side, because she had asked him to, and because there was no version of this he intended to watch from a chair. Kosh stood with them, and the old ship's captain, and Dessa with her data slate loaded with every recording the last 2 days had produced, and behind them, filling the gallery seats along the chamber's rear wall, a dozen old-line Ilan exiles, and Rennick still hadn't fully processed this, Ossic Thane, arms crossed, jaw set, present and visible, and no longer pretending he had nothing to answer for either. Corvin Dreeth arrived precisely on time, which told Rennick something about the man before he'd said a single word. Not the rushed, desperate arrival of someone caught out, but the measured, unhurried entrance of a man who still believed, on some level, that the room would ultimately bend to whichever version of events he chose to present. He was not what Rennick had pictured. No armor, no ceremony, no cold military bearing like oars, just a lean, silver-templed Ilan man in a plain, dark formal coat, moving with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a career winning rooms through patience rather than force, 2 aides trailing a respectful half-step behind him. "Highness," Dreeth said, and inclined his head to Vessa with a courtesy so smooth it was almost more unsettling than open hostility would have been. "I confess I did not expect to find you quite this resilient. My office was, evidently, working from incomplete information." "Your office worked from exactly the information you gave it," Vessa said. "You told them I was a loose end to be quietly filed away. You did not tell them I was a person, because admitting that would have complicated the arithmetic considerably." Dreeth's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did, a brief flicker of recalibration. "You always did have your mother's talent for making a difficult truth sound like an accusation," he said, almost fond, almost regretful, and Rennick understood in that single sentence more about the shape of this man's ambition than an hour of testimony could have provided. That Dreeth had known this family, had stood close enough to it once to have opinions about her mother's talents, and had turned on it anyway when the arithmetic of power had made that the more profitable choice. "I will not waste this tribunal's time pretending I bear you no responsibility, Highness. I ordered the severance. I authorized your sale into the border markets rather than a cleaner solution, because I believed, genuinely believed, it was the more merciful choice available to me. Ilandra was unstable. Your continued existence as a rallying point for the old court would have meant civil war, real casualties, thousands of lives rather than one inconvenient heir quietly reduced to nothing anyone would think to look for. I made a hard calculation in service of stability. I have never pretended otherwise, to myself or to anyone who has asked directly." "You have pretended otherwise to everyone who did not ask directly," Kosh said, sharp, stepping forward despite her age, despite 6 years of exile that had never quite burned the fire out of her. "You issued a quiet death notice, Dreeth. You let the court believe she was dead rather than sold, because a dead heir generates sympathy you could manage, and a sold one generates outrage you could not. That is not stability. That is cowardice wearing stability's coat." "Careful, magistrate," one of Dreeth's aides began, but Dreeth raised a hand, mild, unbothered, and the aide fell silent. "Let her speak," Dreeth said. "I did not come here to silence anyone further. I came, in fact, to make an offer, and I would ask the governor's patience while I make it plainly." He turned back to Vessa, and something in his measured composure shifted for the first time, an actual edge of urgency finally showing through the practiced calm. "The old court law is clear, Highness, and you know it as well as I do. A verified thou claim, publicly witnessed, cannot be unsaid. You have already won that particular fact, whatever happens in this room tonight. I am not fool enough to pretend otherwise to this tribunal. What remains an open question is what you intend to do with the winning of it. Ilandra is not the stable world it was 6 years ago. My continuity office has held it together, imperfectly, through 6 years of factional pressure that would have torn a lesser administration apart. If you return now, claim the throne outright, and immediately begin dismantling everything my office has built to keep the peace, you will not inherit a kingdom. You will inherit the exact civil war I severed your bond sense to prevent in the first place." His eyes held hers, and whatever else the man was, Rennick understood watching him that he at least believed every word of what he was saying. "I am offering you a regency transition instead. Shared continuity, phased over 3 years, my office managing security and treaty obligations, while you rebuild the trust my predecessor's war cost the crown. It is not the outcome your grief wants tonight. It is the outcome that keeps Ilindra from burning." The chamber went very still. Rennick watched Vessa's face, watched her weigh it, not dismiss it out of hand, which surprised him, but actually weigh it, the particular stillness of a woman who had been raised from birth to put a kingdom's stability ahead of her own vindication, turning the offer over with the same careful arithmetic she turned over everything. "That is almost a good offer," Vessa said finally. "It has the shape of statesmanship. I could almost respect it if it did not also happen to leave you holding exactly the power you seized by having me sold as scrap on a border market 3 weeks ago." Her voice hardened, old court steel settling fully back into it. "You want me to believe your severance order was mercy. Perhaps, in the coldest arithmetic, some part of it even was. But mercy does not require a hand-painted sign, Regent. Mercy does not require a 15-credit release tax and a broker too indifferent to bother learning my name. You did not merely remove me from the succession. You made certain that if I somehow survived it, I would survive having been told, publicly, repeatedly, by everyone who touched me along the way that I was worth nothing at all. That was not stability. That was cruelty dressed as necessity, and I have spent 6 days learning the difference from people who owed me nothing and gave me dignity anyway. I do not intend to unlearn that lesson now in exchange for a phased transition that leaves you comfortable." "Then what would you have this tribunal do?" Dreeth said, and for the first time real strain showed under the measured calm, the sound of a man watching a carefully built argument fail to land. "Strip my office by force from a governor's chamber on a neutral station 400 light-years from the throne. You have no fleet, Highness. You have a mechanic, an exiled magistrate, and a room full of witnesses. That is a moral victory. It is not a government." "No," Vessa agreed, "it is not tonight. But it is a beginning, and beginnings are all any government has ever been made of." She looked past him, to the governor at the long curved table, and drew a slow breath, and Rennick watched her set aside grief and vindication both, deliberately, in favor of something more useful. "Governor, I am not asking this tribunal to strip Regent Dreeth of his continuity office tonight. I lack the standing and frankly the desire to govern Ilindra by force from a border station. What I am asking this tribunal to enter into permanent record, broadcast, witnessed, unerasable, is the truth of what was done to secure that office 6 years ago, and what was done again 3 weeks past to keep it secured. Let that truth exist publicly, alongside my verified claim, so that when I do return to Ilindra, and I will return, Regent, on my own timeline, not yours, I return as a known truth rather than a rumor the continuity office can still manage away in whispers. That is not a demand for your throne tonight. It is a demand that you never again be permitted to pretend this did not happen." Dreeth was quiet a long moment, and something in his face, the careful statesman's calm, finally cracked, not into fury, but into something more tired, more human, the look of a man who had built 6 years of careful justification and was watching it become insufficient in real time. "You understand what that record does to my position," he said, "even without a fleet at your back. Every faction I have spent 6 years holding together will know exactly what was done, and by whom, and will use it against me the moment it is politically useful to do so." "Yes," Vessa said, "I understand that precisely. It is in fact the entire point." Dessa stepped forward then, at a nod from Kosh, and set her data slate on the long curved table in front of the governor, cued and ready, and the recordings played out across the chamber's own display in silence. The market row and the hand-painted sign, time-stamped and geotagged to Thane's stall 6 days prior. The junction ambush and Colonel Orr's own recorded words, backed by his subsequent formal statement, filed that morning through channels Kosh had quietly arranged, resigning his commission and confirming, on record, the order chain that had authorized the attempt. The Assembly Hall verification, broadcast live and already permanent across the ring's public relay network. The ambush crew's connection to a shell payment rooted, according to the security captain's own inquiry, through an account traceable 3 steps back to Dreith's continuity office. It was not, Rennick understood watching it assembled end to end for the first time, a case built on grief or sympathy at all. It was simply the truth, laid out in order, unhurried, allowed to speak for itself. Ossic Thane rose from the gallery when the recordings finished, unbidden, and the governor's eyes moved to him with mild surprise. "I sold her," Thane said, into the chamber's stillness, voice rough. "I don't have a fancy word for what that makes me, and I'm not going to pretend the shame of it started tonight. But I'll say this for the record, since apparently that's what's wanted, nobody paid me to write that sign. I wrote it myself. Out of nothing but not wanting to be bothered doing right by stock I decided wasn't worth the trouble. And when men with real money came asking whether I remembered where she'd gone, I told them the truth because the money was good, and I told myself it wasn't my business what happened after. It became my business the second I understood what after meant for her. I'm not asking forgiveness. I'm just saying, for whatever it's worth to this tribunal, that a regent who pays men to erase inconvenient women quietly built exactly the kind of market where a broker like me could sell one for 15 credits and never once think twice about it until it was almost too late to matter. That's not just his crime. But he built the road that let it happen easy." The chamber was silent a long moment after that, and Dreith, standing very still at the center of it, looked, for the first time since he'd walked in, like a man who understood the room had already reached its verdict before the governor had spoken a single formal word. The governor spoke at last, unhurried, the neutral measured cadence of someone whose authority rested entirely on being seen as fair rather than powerful. "This tribunal has no standing to adjudicate Ilindra's internal succession, and will not attempt to. What this tribunal does have standing to do is certify, into permanent treaty record, the facts entered before it tonight, the verified bloodline claim of Vesa of the House of Thal, and the documented conduct of Ilindra's continuity office in attempting to suppress that claim through severance, sale, and subsequent armed action on neutral territory. That record is entered as of this hour, broadcast, and will remain accessible to any treaty signatory who wishes to review it." He looked at Dreith, not unkindly but without any softness either. "Regent, you are free to return to Ilindra tonight. Nothing in this tribunal compels your removal, but you will return to a government that now knows, permanently and publicly, exactly what was done in its name. I expect you understand better than any of us in this room what that knowledge is likely to cost you, over time, without a single soldier needing to lift a weapon to collect the debt." Dreith held Vesa's gaze a long moment across the quiet chamber, and something passed between them that wasn't quite reconciliation and wasn't quite defeat either. The recognition, maybe, of two people who had both spent this last hour doing the hardest arithmetic of their lives and arriving at entirely different answers. "You could have destroyed me tonight, with a fleet at your back and no mercy at all, and no one in this room would have called it unjust," Dreith said quietly, to Vesa, almost only to her. "You chose the truth instead. I do not know yet whether that makes you a better ruler than I have been, or simply a luckier one, with time still ahead of you to find out which. I hope, for Ilindra's sake, it is the former." "So do I," Vesa said. "Go home, Regent. Govern honestly while the record is watching you do it. That is the only mercy I have left to offer, and it is considerably more than you offered me 3 weeks ago in a windowless room." Dreeth inclined his head, a real bow this time, not the smooth, practiced courtesy from earlier, and turned, and walked from the chamber with his 2 aides trailing him, and did not look back, and the tribunal, without further ceremony, was over. The chamber emptied slowly after that, the particular loose-limbed exhaustion of people who had spent 6 days running on fear, finally allowed to set their shoulders down. Kosh embraced Vesa without ceremony, old formality forgotten entirely, and murmured something in Old Court Ilan that made Vesa laugh again, short and startled and real. The same rare sound Rennick had first heard in the back office of Vale Salvage, what felt now like a lifetime ago rather than 6 days. The old ship's captain shook Rennick's good hand with a grip that nearly undid the medic's careful shoulder work, muttering something about mechanics with more nerve than sense. Dessac collected her data slate with the brisk satisfaction of a woman who had just made the best trade of her career and knew it. Thane lingered longest, hanging back near the chamber's rear doors until most of the others had filed out, and when he finally approached Rennick and Vesa both, his heavy face was doing something awkward and unpracticed, a man reaching for a gesture he didn't have the vocabulary for. "I'm not going to make a speech out of it," Thane said. "Figure you've had enough speeches tonight. He stopped, started again. "The release tax, 15 credits, I'm giving it back. Not because it fixes anything, because keeping it feels worse now than it did a week ago, and I'd like to stop feeling that particular way if it's all the same to you." He held out the coins, and Vesa looked at them a long moment, and then, gently, closed his hand back around them. "Keep it," she said. "Not as forgiveness. I am not prepared to offer that yet, and I would rather not lie to you about it. Keep it as a debt you remember owing, Ossic Thane, the next time somebody stands chained under a sign on your row, and you decide it is faster not to ask their name. That is worth more to me than 15 credits returned." Thane's jaw worked, and he nodded once, and didn't try to make it into anything softer than what it was, and left the chamber without another word. And Rennick understood, watching him go, that whatever came next for the man, he would carry that particular unfinished debt a long way further than 15 credits could have settled it. Colonel Vasek Orr was waiting outside the chamber doors when they finally emerged into the ring's cool corridor air, out of uniform now, dressed plain, a man who had clearly already begun the long process of becoming someone other than a continuity office's director. He didn't approach immediately, and Vesa was the one who crossed to him first. "You resigned," she said. "This morning. Filed the statement Kosh's people needed before I lost the nerve to do it properly." Orr's mouth did something wry and tired. "I served 3 regents believing service itself was the virtue, regardless of what it was in service to. Tonight's tribunal disabused me of that particular comfort rather thoroughly. I find I do not much regret the loss of it." He looked at Vesa a long moment, Old Court waiting it again. "I have no standing to ask anything of you, Highness. I only wish to say, before you leave this station, that whatever government eventually rises around your return to Ilindra, should you find yourself in one of people who have already learned, the hard way, exactly what loyalty is not worth spending on, I would count it an honor to be considered." "I will remember it," Vesa said, echoing deliberately the words she'd given him in the junction 2 days before, and something in Orr's weathered face eased at the recognition of it. "Go rest, Colonel. Ilindra is not returning to order tonight, and neither, I think, are you." They walked back toward the docks in the ring's slow, artificial dawn, Harlan limping between them with his arms still slung but his stubborn stride unslowed, and nobody spoke much. The particular comfortable silence of people who had run out of urgent things to say and hadn't yet found the shape of the ordinary conversation that came after. It was Rennick who broke it, eventually, somewhere on the walkway above the market row, looking down at the familiar tangle of stalls and awnings just beginning to stir with the morning's first vendors. "What happens now," he said, "to you?" To all of it. Vesa was quiet a moment, watching the market wake up below them, the same row where a hand-painted sign had hung 6 days ago over a woman the whole street had agreed was worth nothing. "I do not return to Ilindra tomorrow," she said. "Or next week. The record is entered, permanent, unerasable. That fact does not require my physical presence to keep working on my behalf. Dreeth will govern under its weight for however long it takes the factions to decide what to do with it, and I intend to let that process happen slowly, deliberately, rather than rushing home to force a crown onto my own head before I have rebuilt any of the trust his coup cost the throne to begin with. Kosh believes it will be a year, perhaps 2, before the timing is right. I'm inclined to trust her judgment over my own grief's impatience." Her eyes came to him, steady, and something careful and hopeful moved behind them that he hadn't seen from her even in the tribunal chamber's victory. "Which leaves a year, perhaps 2, in which I am simply here, alive, unbonded, unclaimed by any court, no sign over my head declaring my worth to anyone passing by. I find I do not entirely know what to do with that much unclaimed time, Rennick Vale. I have never once in my life been permitted to simply exist without a title attached to the permission." "I might have some ideas," Rennick said, "about what to do with unclaimed time. I run a salvage shop. There's always more coolant manifolds than hands to fix them." Vesa laughed, real, unguarded, the sound he'd been quietly hoarding since the first time he'd earned it, and reached for his good hand without either of them needing to discuss the gesture anymore. And they walked the rest of the way to the shop together, past the shuttered noodle stall and the honest levels and the row where Thane's stall was already reopening for the morning trade. And none of it, not one part of the walk, felt like the ending of anything at all. It felt, Rennick understood, like the very beginning of an entirely different arithmetic, one that had started 6 days ago with 15 credits and a sign that had been wrong about absolutely everything it claimed to know. The delegation arrived 11 weeks later, on a transport considerably less threatening than Dreeth's cutter had been, but no less formal for it. 3 envoys from the reconstituted Ilindra Court Council, dispatched, their credentials claimed, to assess the practical viability of a Thal restoration before the council would commit its own standing to backing one. Kosh had warned them it would come to this eventually. Rennick, elbow-deep in a coolant manifold when the message reached the shop, hadn't quite believed how fast eventually would arrive. The envoys met with Vesa in Kosh's office, the same narrow room where the verification had first been sworn, and Rennick came because Vesa asked him to, and stood at the back of the room this time rather than beside her, because she had explained to him, gently but plainly, that whatever came of this meeting, she needed the envoys to see her standing as a sovereign making a choice, not a woman leaning on a man for support she didn't require. He understood the reasoning. He hated it a little anyway. He stood at the back and watched. The lead envoy was an older Ilin woman named Saril Adin, silver-haired, formally dressed, her manner courteous, but exacting in the way of someone whose entire career had been built on finding the flaw in an argument before it became someone else's expensive mistake. "The verification stands," Adin said, after the formalities had been exchanged, after Kosh had walked them through the tribunal record in full. "The council does not dispute the lattice, nor the old charter's authority to certify it. That much, Highness, is settled beyond argument." She paused, and something in her careful courtesy sharpened by 1 degree. "What is not settled is the manner of your return, and specifically the council has asked me to raise directly, without softening it, because softening it would only delay the same conversation, the matter of the human." "His name is Rennick Vale," Vesa said, "and you may address the matter of him directly to me, since I am the one who intends to keep him near, whatever the council decides to think of it." Adin inclined her head, unbothered by the correction, the manner of a woman who'd expected exactly this response and had already built her argument around it. "Understood, Highness. My concern is not personal to the man. I have no doubt from the tribunal record that he has earned considerable loyalty. My concern is structural. Ilindra has spent 6 years rebuilding from a coup that began, in no small part, because a previous regime was perceived as too permissive of foreign influence in the succession. A Thal heir returning with a human consort at her side, however earned that bond, hands every remaining Dreith loyalist a ready-made argument that the restoration itself is compromised, foreign, illegitimate by the same old suspicions that let the coup happen in the first place. I am not telling you this to wound you. I am telling you because it is the exact argument that will be made the moment you set foot on Ilindra soil, by people considerably less honest than I am being with you right now, and I would rather you hear it plainly from an ally first. The room was quiet a moment. Rennick felt the old cold weight settle back into his chest, the same one from the noodle stall room 11 weeks ago. I'm not royalty. Tomorrow you're going to become something I don't have a word for, except now it had teeth. Now it had an actual delegation putting numbers and politics behind the fear rather than just his own doubt. There is old charter law, Vesa said steady, predating the bond caste tradition itself, which states plainly that a reigning Thal may marry with open eyes, having seen the person clearly, regardless of caste, nobility, or species, provided the choice is made without the bond sense to disguise what she is choosing. I do not need the council's permission to invoke it. I have already told Kash as much, and she has already confirmed the law's standing. I am not asking this delegation whether I am allowed to keep him. I am telling this delegation, plainly, that I intend to, and asking instead whether the council wishes to spend its political capital fighting a settled law, or spend it instead helping me build the argument that will actually matter to Dreith loyalists, which is not who I choose to love, Envoy Aden, but whether I govern well enough that the question stops mattering to anyone but the people small-minded enough to still be asking it in 5 years. Aden's mouth did something that might, on a less careful woman, have been the beginning of a smile. That is a considerably better answer than most heirs manage on their first attempt at it, she said. Very well. The old law stands, and the council will not waste capital contesting a settled charter provision. That would only hand the Dreith loyalists a legal fight they'd win on optics regardless of the law's actual text. But I would ask, Highness, if you will permit it, to put one further question to the man himself, since the council will require some account of him beyond the tribunal record before it can honestly tell skeptics what sort of consort it is vouching for. Vesa looked back at Rennick, a question in it, and he stepped forward, properly forward this time, into the room's center rather than its back edge, because whatever this was, it wasn't a moment to be watched from a distance. Ask, Rennick said. Aden studied him a long moment, the same clinical, cataloging look Vesa had given him outside Thane's stall 11 weeks ago, though considerably less hostile in its intent. You are aware, I take it, of what you are agreeing to stand beside. Not the woman in this room, I do not doubt you understand her well enough by now. I mean the office, the politics. The very real chance that some faction on Ilindra decides you are easier to remove than she is, and comes for you the way Dreith's people already have once. What is it you believe you are bringing to that arithmetic, Rennick Vale, that a council should consider worth the risk of vouching for? Rennick thought about it honestly, rather than reaching for something that sounded good, because he suspected Aden would spot the difference instantly. Nothing that outranks anybody in this delegation, he said. I don't have old court law memorized. I don't have a fleet. I don't have a bloodline that means anything past this station's scrap market. What I've got is that I stopped in front of a market stall 6 days into knowing her existed, when every smart calculation I'd built my whole life told me to keep walking, because the sign over her head was lying and I could tell it was lying just by looking at her for 1 extra second. I've been doing that same math every day since, the smart version and the true version, and picking true even when it costs me. I figure a council that spent 6 years relearning the difference between stability and cowardice might find some use in a consort who's already had that particular practice. Adin was quiet a long moment and then, unexpectedly, laughed, a short, dry, genuinely surprised sound. Kosh warned me you would say something like that. I confess I did not fully believe her. She looked to Vesa, formal again, the courteous exactness settling back over her like a coat resettled onto its proper shoulders. The council will vouch for the restoration, Highness, and will not contest the consort provision. I would advise patience still, a year, perhaps somewhat more, to let the records wait finish its work on Dreith's remaining loyalists before you return in person. But when you do return, I do not believe you will find this particular argument waiting to ambush you. I intend to have already spent it on your behalf before you ever set foot on Ilandra soil. Thank you, Envoy, Vesa said, and something in her voice, formal as it stayed, carried real warmth underneath it. Do not thank me yet, Adin said, rising, gathering her formal robes with brisk efficiency. Thank me when the restoration actually holds. I have seen enough hopeful beginnings collapse under bad governance to reserve my gratitude for outcomes rather than intentions. But at the door, she paused and looked back once more at Rennick, and something in her exacting, careful face softened by a genuine degree. For what it is worth, mechanic, the sign was wrong. I have read the tribunal record twice now. I do not think I have ever read a clearer refutation of one in my career. And then she was gone, her two junior envoys trailing behind her, and the narrow office was quiet again, and Vesa crossed it to stand in front of him, close, her black eyes bright. You did not need to say all of that, she said. The old law already settled the legal question. You could have simply stood there and let the charter do the work. I know, Rennick said. I wanted her to actually believe it, though, not just the law, the reason. Vesa's hand came up to rest against his jaw, careful, deliberate, the same open-palmed offering he'd given her outside Thane's stall 11 weeks ago now returned to him in full. And Rennick understood, standing in that narrow office with the delegation's transport already lifting off somewhere beyond the window, that whatever came next, a year of patience, a restoration built slow and honest rather than rushed and fragile, a throne he still didn't fully have language for standing beside. The actual answer to Adin's question had never really been in doubt at all. The year that followed did not feel, most days, like the waiting room for a restoration. It felt like an ordinary life, which was, Rennick came to understand, exactly the gift Vesa had been asking the delegation for without quite having the words to name it that way, time in which she was simply a person, unbonded and untitled in the day-to-day texture of things, learning what it meant to exist without a court's expectations pressing in on every hour. She learned to read a coolant gauge properly within a month. Out of what she claimed was boredom and Rennick suspected was something closer to hunger. A woman who had spent her whole life being told her worth lay in translation and diplomacy, discovering, with visible delight, that her hands were also good for something as simple and honest as fixing what was broken. Harlan, grudging at first, came to depend on her steadiness with a soldering iron more than he'd ever admit out loud, and took to introducing her to customers, when he introduced her at all, simply as my other mechanic, which Vesa treated as the highest compliment she'd been paid in years. She still woke before dawn most mornings, old habit dying slow, and Rennick stopped trying to talk her out of it and started simply joining her instead, sitting together in the shop's gray early light with 2 cups of the same bitter dockside tea, not needing to fill every silence with conversation the way they'd needed to in that first frightened week. The threats did not vanish entirely. Kosh warned them they wouldn't, and she was right. Twice that year, quiet men asked too many questions at the wrong stalls, and twice Dissaz's network flagged it fast enough that nothing came of it beyond a tense evening and a change of routine for a week or two. Once in the 9th month, a man matching no description they recognized was found loitering near the shop's back entrance 3 nights running, and it was Vesa, not Rennick, who confronted him directly in the alley rather than waiting for danger to choose its own moment, Old court-trained instinct sharpened rather than dulled by a year of ordinary life. And the man, when pressed, turned out to be nothing more sinister than a freelance information broker, hoping to sell an exclusive account of the restored heir's border station romance to a court gossip circuit back on Ilindra. Vesa had laughed about it for a week afterward, the specific absurdity of surviving Dreith's continuity office only to be nearly startled into a fight by a gossip columnist, and Rennick had laughed with her, and understood that the laughter itself, easy, unguarded, entirely without the market stall wariness that had defined her for the first 4 days he'd known her, was its own kind of victory nobody's tribunal record would ever formally certify. Kash's updates from Ilindra arrived steadily through the year, careful and measured, the record's weight doing its slow work exactly as Adin had promised, Dreith loyalist factions fracturing under scrutiny they couldn't quite outlast, moderate councils gaining ground as the continuity office's older abuses came further into the light, one investigation at a time. Dreith himself, to Rennick's mild surprise, did not fight the process as hard as everyone had braced for. He governed, by all reports, more honestly than he had in years, whether from genuine reflection or simple survival instinct Rennick couldn't say and didn't much care to guess. It was, Kash observed dryly in one of her longer letters, the strangest possible outcome of a coup and an attempted assassination, a regent quietly becoming a better one, chastened into it by the weight of a record he could no longer pretend didn't exist. It was in the 11th month, on an evening no different from 100 others, that Vesa found Rennick in the shop after closing, elbow-deep in a manifold that had nothing wrong with it he hadn't already fixed twice that week, and set the signet down on the workbench between them the way she had on that second night in this very room, a lifetime and a year ago. Adin's latest letter arrived this morning, Vesa said. The council believes the timing is close now, perhaps 3 months, perhaps 4. Rennick set down his tools. You ready for it? I do not know that anyone is ever fully ready to become what they were always meant to be, Vesa said. I have spent this year learning that readiness was never actually the requirement. Only honesty was. She looked at him, steady, and something in her posture told him this wasn't idle conversation, that she'd been building toward this moment across the whole quiet evening. I am not asking you to be ready either, Rennick Vale. I am asking you something considerably more specific. When the council sends word that the timing has finally come, I intend to return to Ilindra and take up a throne I did not ask for and cannot honestly say I still entirely want, except that abandoning it now would abandon every person on that world still waiting for something better than what Dreith's coup gave them. I would like to make that crossing as your wife, under old charter law, sworn before witnesses on this station before we ever board a ship. Not because a queen requires a consort for legitimacy, Adin already settled that question for us 11 weeks ago, but because I do not wish to walk into that new life carrying an unfinished sentence between us. I would like it finished. Here. Before Ilindra gets a single say in the shape of it. Rennick looked at her a long moment, the signet catching the shop's overhead light between them, the same strange resonant colors it had thrown in Kash's narrow office a year ago, and understood that whatever answer he gave next was the only piece of arithmetic left in this whole long year that had never actually been in question. Yes, he said simply, because she'd taught him, across a year of learning her plainness, that the simple true answer always landed harder than the elaborate one. Whatever old charter law wants us to swear to, I'll swear it. I already meant it 6 days after I met you. I've just been waiting for the right room to say it in. Vesa's composure, the same iron composure she'd carried through Thane's stall and Orr's junction and Dreith's tribunal, broke completely this time, into a smile so wide and unguarded that Rennick understood he was looking at something almost nobody in her entire royal life had ever actually been permitted to see. And she crossed the small distance of the workbench and pressed her forehead to his, exactly the way she had on the wet ferrocrete outside the governor's tower a year before. Except this time there was no fear folded into it at all. Only the plain, uncomplicated fact of two people who had already, a long time before either of them said it aloud, chosen each other completely. They were married 3 weeks later, in the assembly hall where the verification had first been broadcast to the whole ring, because Vesa had insisted on it plainly. Not the governor's neutral chamber, not some borrowed grandeur meant to look more fitting for a queen, but the same cavernous, echoing, unglamorous hall where 200 dock workers and scrap crews had first watched a sign get proven wrong. Kosh performed the old charter rite herself, formal and precise and visibly fighting back tears through most of it, and the witnesses who mattered were not foreign dignitaries or court nobility, but the people who had actually earned the right to stand in that room. Harlan, upright despite a shoulder that still ached in cold weather, in a jacket Rennick had never once seen him wear. Dessat, missing half a finger and grinning the whole ceremony like she'd brokered the best deal of her life. The old ship's captain, gruff and visibly moved and pretending not to be. A dozen old-line exiles who had knelt in Kosh's office a year before and now stood instead, upright, witnessing something considerably more hopeful than a verification of loss. Ossik Thane came too, standing near the back the way he had at the tribunal, and when the rite called for any present to speak a blessing on the bond, he was the one, unexpectedly, who stepped forward first. "I don't know the old words," Thane said, rough, plain, unpracticed at ceremony of any kind. "I'll just say the true one instead, since that seems to be the custom around this particular pair. I sold this woman for 15 credits because a sign was faster than doing right by her. I've spent a year watching what came of somebody deciding to do right by her instead. If that's not worth a blessing, I don't know what is." He looked at Vesa, then at Rennick, and something in his heavy, unlovely face had finally, fully settled into something like peace. "Wanted Her Highness. For the record, whatever that sign said, I want you both to have every bit of good this arithmetic still owes you." Vesa's eyes were wet through the entire ceremony but composed, the same wet but composed steadiness that had carried her through every hard room of the last year. And when Kosh finally pronounced the old formal words that bound the rite closed, words Rennick's translator Patch rendered, roughly, as chosen before witnesses, without the sense to disguise the choosing, she turned to him, hand finding his the way it had found it 100 times before in 100 harder rooms, and said the only line either of them had actually written for themselves, unscripted, plain, entirely their own. "You paid 15 credits for something the whole market had already decided was worthless," Vesa said, loud enough to carry through the whole quiet hall. "I would like it on record, before every witness in this room, that it was the single best trade anyone on this station has made in living memory, and that I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you never once regret it." "Already don't," Rennick said. "Haven't since the first day." The hall didn't erupt into cheering this time either. It still wasn't that kind of crowd, but the sound that moved through it was warmer than cheering. The low rolling murmur of 200 people who had watched a woman go from a sign over her head to a crown she hadn't yet claimed, choosing, in between those two facts, an ordinary mechanic from their own gray, rainy dock, and finding in that choice something that felt, to everyone standing in that hall, considerably more honest than any coronation was likely to feel later. They left for Ilindra 4 months after that, on a modest transport Kosh had arranged rather than anything grand enough to announce itself, and the crossing took the better part of 3 weeks, long enough for Rennick to learn, slowly, the particular strangeness of watching a woman he'd married in a scrap market assembly hall settle back into the bearing of a queen the closer they came to a world he'd never seen, her spine straightening by degrees, her old court formality returning like a garment refitted after a long season away, though she never once let it fully close the distance between the woman who had cried openly in a governor's medical bay and the sovereign who would step off this transport in 3 weeks' time. He stood beside her at the observation port on the final approach, Ilindra hanging blue-green and cloud-wrapped ahead of them, and felt the old cold weight settle back into his chest one more time. The same fear from the noodle stall room, the delegation's office, every room where the gap between mechanic and consort had threatened to widen past crossing. Second thoughts, Vesa said, not quite a question, watching him rather than the planet. Not about you, Rennick said. Never about you, just this is real now. Not a market row, not a station tribunal. An actual world, an actual court, an actual crown you're about to put back on. I've had a year to get used to the idea. I'm not sure a year's enough to get used to the reality of it. Vesa took his hand, the same open, deliberate offering it had always been between them, and held it against the cold viewport glass, Ilandra's slow turning light catching in her black eyes. Then we will get used to it together, she said, the same way we have gotten used to everything else since a hand-painted sign lied about both of us at once. You, about being nobody worth remembering, and me, about being nothing worth wanting. We were both of us wrong about ourselves in exactly the ways this last year has spent proving otherwise. I do not see any reason a throne should be the one arithmetic we suddenly stopped trusting ourselves to solve. The transport began its final descent, the hull humming low around them, and Rennick Vale, mechanic, husband, consort, a man who had once been certain that minding exactly one business was the only way to stay solvent on the docks, held his wife's hand against the cooling glass, and watched a world neither sign nor market nor usurper had ever managed to keep them from reaching, rising slowly to meet them both. The landing field outside the old capital was smaller than Rennick had expected, worn ferrocrete rather than the gleaming pomp he'd half-braced for. A scattering of council officials and a modest honor guard waiting under a gray, overcast sky that reminded him, absurdly, of the docks he'd left behind. Aden stood at the front of the gathered party, formal robes crisp despite the drizzle, and beside her, Kosh, who had returned ahead of them by 2 weeks to help smooth the ground for exactly this moment, and behind them both, a crowd larger than the official party, ordinary Ilandra citizens, kept back behind a loose cordon, drawn by word that had traveled faster and further than any council announcement could have managed on its own. Vesa descended the transport ramp first, and Rennick watched her spine find its full old court height with each step, watched a year of scrapyard mornings and coolant manifolds fold itself, without disappearing, into the bearing of a woman who had been raised from birth to carry exactly this weight. She stopped at the base of the ramp, and for a long moment simply stood there, breathing air she had not breathed freely in over a year, eyes closing briefly before opening again, wet but composed, the same steady wet-eyed dignity that had carried her through every hard room since a market stall 6 days into all of this had first tried to tell her otherwise. Aden approached and knelt, not the stiff formal genuflection of ceremony, Rennick understood watching it, but something closer to genuine relief given physical shape, and the gesture rippled outward through the official party the way it had rippled through Kosh's crowded office a year before, chair by chair, person by person, until the whole gathered delegation knelt on the wet ferrocrete beneath a gray Ilandra sky. The crowd beyond the cordon did not kneel, ordinary citizens rarely did, Rennick was learning, the gesture reserved for court and council rather than common folk, but a sound moved through them instead, a low swelling murmur that built slowly into something closer to a cheer than anything the assembly hall back on the station had ever produced. 2,000 people who had lived 6 years under a regime built on a coup and a quiet lie. Watching the lie's final unraveling arrive in the shape of a woman, stepping off a modest transport rather than a conquering fleet. Rise, Vesa said, the same word she had used in Kosh's narrow office a year ago, and the delegation rose, and she turned, finally, and held out her hand to Rennick still standing at the top of the ramp. The same open offered palm he had given her outside Thane's stall, returned now for what felt like the 100th time between them and would, he understood, be offered 1,000 more before either of them was done needing it. He came down the ramp and took it, and the crowd's murmur shifted at the sight of it, Not hostile, not the ambush of prejudice Adin had warned them to expect, but curious, watchful, a whole world taking its first look at the mechanic their queen had chosen and deciding, collectively, slowly, to reserve judgment rather than render it instantly, the way the market row had rendered its judgment on Vessa's 6 days into a story that had started with nothing more than a hand-painted sign. "They will not all love you instantly," Vessa said quietly, for him alone, as they crossed the wet field together toward the waiting delegation. "Some will not love you at all, for a long while, perhaps ever. That is the honest cost of the old law we invoked, and I will not pretend it away to make this moment feel easier than it is." "I didn't marry you for easy," Rennick said. "I bought you free for 15 credits from a man who thought you were worth nothing at all, and I've spent a year proving that arithmetic wrong one day at a time. I figure a planet's not so different from a market row once you get down to it, just bigger and slower to convince." Vessa's laugh carried across the wet field, startled and bright, and Adin, close enough to hear it, allowed herself the smallest genuine smile Rennick had seen on the woman since the day she'd first walked into Kasha's office to test them both. The formal coronation would come later, weeks of council preparation still ahead of them, old ceremony to be relearned and adapted, a throne room to be reopened after 6 years of Dreith's austere continuity office use, 100 small political fires still needing to be walked carefully rather than rushed. Rennick understood, standing on that wet landing field with his wife's hand in his, and an entire watching world recalculating its assumptions in real time, that none of the hard work was actually finished. It was, if anything, only now properly beginning, the same way the tribunal chamber had only been a beginning, the same way the verification in Kasha's narrow office had only been a beginning. Every real victory in the last year turning out, on reflection, to be less an ending than a door held open long enough for the next honest thing to walk through it. That evening, in a modest wing of the half-restored palace that had once housed minor court functionaries rather than royalty, far from the throne room's unfinished grandeur, Vessa set the signet down on a plain wooden table between them. The same gesture from the noodle stall room, from the shop workbench, from every quiet moment across the last year where she'd chosen to lay the weight of her whole inheritance down beside him rather than carry it alone. "I keep thinking about the sign," she said, turning the crystal slow in the lamplight, watching its strange, resonant colors shift. "Free. Nobody wants her. I have read a great many formal documents in my life, Rennick treaties, court judgments, verification cants centuries old. None of them have ever been proven wrong quite so thoroughly, or quite so fast, as 4 words some indifferent broker scrawled on a scrap of packing plastic, because writing the truth would have cost him an extra 10 minutes. For what it's worth, Rennick said, I've thought about it plenty too, standing there in the rain reading it. I keep landing on the same thing every time. Which is that the sign wasn't lying about the free part, he said. Just about everything after it, you were free. You'd always been free. Dreith just spent a great deal of effort trying to convince the whole galaxy otherwise. And it turned out the galaxy didn't actually agree with him once somebody bothered to ask it properly. He reached across the plain table and closed his hand over hers, over the signet, over the whole strange, improbable year that had started with 15 credits and a decision he still, honestly, couldn't fully explain except to say it had felt in the moment like the only true thing available to him. Nobody wants her. That's the part that was never true. I wanted you the first day I saw you sitting in that mud with your spine still straight, refusing to perform anything for a crowd that had already decided your worth, without asking you a single question. I've just been slow, same as always, about saying it plainly. Vessa turned her hand under his, lacing their fingers together the way she had that first night above the noodle stall, and the crown that waited for her somewhere down a hallway still unfinished, in a throne room still being reopened one careful room at a time, could wait a little longer yet for the two of them to simply sit together in a small, quiet room, chosen and choosing, exactly the way they had decided, 6 days into an impossible year, that they intended to go on being. The coronation came 7 weeks later, in a throne room finally scrubbed clean of 6 years' austere continuity office use. Banners the deep old red of the House of Thal hung fresh against walls that had gone bare and gray under Dreith's administration. Sunlight pouring through tall windows that had, Kosh told him, been kept deliberately shuttered for most of the coup years, as though even daylight had needed rationing under a regime built on quiet erasure. Rennick stood near the front of the gathered court, not at the center of it. Vesa had been playing with him about that too, in the weeks of preparation, that the ceremony belonged to Ilindra and its long memory more than it belonged to either of them personally. And he'd found he didn't mind standing slightly apart from the center of it, understanding by now that his place in her life had never actually depended on standing in the middle of every room she commanded. She wore no elaborate ceremonial gown, not the heavy jewel-crusted formality half the older nobility had quietly expected. Kosh had advised against it, and Vesa had agreed readily, choosing instead a simple deep-red court robe with the Thal crest worked in silver thread at the collar, understated in a way that said, to anyone paying close attention, exactly what kind of reign she intended to build. The old crown itself, recovered from a vault Dreith's people had never quite dared to loot, was simpler than Rennick had pictured too, a slim circlet of dark oxidized metal rather than a heavy jeweled monstrosity. And when Kosh set it on Vesa's head before the assembled court, the gesture carried none of the theatrical grandeur Rennick had braced himself for and all of the quiet, earned weight of something that had been fought for honestly rather than simply inherited. Long ago, Kosh said, her voice carrying clear and steady across the reopened hall, before this house forgot for a time what it was built to protect, a Thal queen was not crowned for her bloodline alone. She was crowned because she had proven, before witnesses, that she would not discard a single soul her predecessors had once been willing to call worthless. I stand before this court today to say plainly that I have watched this queen prove exactly that, not once, in a single dramatic gesture, but daily, for a full year, in ways both a market row and a border station's noodle stall can attest to far more honestly than any court chronicle ever could. She turned and looked deliberately past the assembled nobility to where Rennick stood, and something in the old magistrate's weathered face was fierce and proud, and entirely unashamed of the tears standing openly in her eyes. Rise, Ilindra. Your queen has already shown you, before you ever asked her to, exactly what kind of reign you have been given back. The hall rose as one, nobility and council, and the ordinary citizens who had been permitted, for the first time in 6 years, to stand at the rear of a coronation rather than watch it filtered through a continuity office's careful broadcast. And the sound that filled the reopened throne room was not the hushed, reverent silence of old formal ceremony, but something louder and rougher and considerably more honest, 2,000 voices finding together. The particular relief of a world getting its story back after 6 years of being told a lie by people who had profited from the telling. Vesa found Rennick's eyes across the crowded hall and held them, the crown sitting light and simple on her dark silver hair, her black eyes wet and bright and entirely composed, and Rennick understood, watching her, that whatever came next, the long, slow work of governing honestly, the factions still to be won over one careful season at a time, the ordinary difficult business of building something better out of 6 years of quiet damage, the actual hardest arithmetic. The one that had started with a hand-painted sign and 15 credits, and a decision he'd made in under a minute without fully understanding its size, had already, a long while ago now, been solved. 2 years later, on a morning that started, as most of them still did, with the same bitter dockside tea, Vesa had never quite given up the habit of brewing herself despite an entire palace kitchen at her disposal. A courier arrived from the border station, with a data packet Kosh had sent along with her usual correspondence. A small addendum, almost an afterthought, tucked at the bottom of an otherwise routine report on the reconstituted council's slow, steady work. It was a photograph, grainy, taken by some dockside vendor's cheap camera, and forwarded along a chain of people who'd apparently decided it was worth the trouble of sending 400 light years. It showed the row at Havern Docks where Thane's stall still stood, repainted now. A small new sign hung above the counter in careful, deliberate lettering that was nothing at all like the hurried scrawl of the one it had replaced. Fair Prices, every name asked first. Vesa read it twice and laughed, the same short startled sound Rennick had first earned from her in a rainy back office a lifetime ago, and set the image down on the table between them where the signet still sat most mornings, a small habitual anchor she'd never fully stopped needing within reach. He kept his word, she said. Small as it was. Small words add up, Rennick said, if enough people keep them long enough. He looked at the photograph a moment longer, the same row, the same wet ferricrete, the same tangle of stalls and awnings where a chained woman under a lying sign had once been the loudest tragedy nobody bothered to notice, and felt something settle in his chest that had taken 2 years, a coronation, and 100 small honest days to finally arrive at rest. Worth remembering where all of it actually started, I think. Not the throne room, not the tribunal. Just a sign, and somebody finally deciding it was wrong. Vesa reached across the table and took his hand, the same open, deliberate offering it had always been between them since the very first morning, queen and mechanic, chosen and choosing, exactly as they had decided, a long time ago now, in a rainy market that had once tried and utterly failed to tell either of them what they were worth. Harlan's letters came less often these days, his hands too stiff now for long correspondence, but he still sent word every few months, gruff and brief, and entirely unsentimental on the surface, always ending the same way regardless of what news filled the middle of the page. The yard's still standing, boy. Don't go soft on me out there. Rennick wrote back every time, and twice a year made the crossing himself, alone or with Vesa when the council's business allowed it, to stand in the old shop with its missing letters still unfixed over the door, VA-SALVAG, because Harlan refused every offer to have it properly repainted, claiming a man ought to be allowed one stubborn thing in his old age that nobody's crown had any say over. DeSaz's information network had grown considerably in 2 years, legitimate now in ways it had never quite managed to be before the tribunal made her name synonymous with the broker who'd broken the story that toppled Aku's careful silence. And she ran a proper office 3 levels up in the honest part of the station these days, though she still kept a stall on the market row too, out of what she called sentiment, and everyone else recognized as loyalty to the place that had made her. Colonel Vasic never did take Vesa up on her offer of a place in the new government. He'd settled instead into quiet civilian work on a neighboring border world, teaching continuity law to students who wanted to understand exactly how easily a good system could be turned toward quiet cruelty if nobody stayed honest about watching it. But he wrote to Kosh regularly, and twice sent testimony, unprompted. When the reconstituted council needed a first-hand account of exactly what the old regime's machinery had looked like from inside it. Some debts, Rennick had come to understand, were paid slowly, in small honest installments, for the rest of a person's life, and Orr seemed content to spend his that way rather than any faster. The court itself had not become easy, not entirely, not even 2 years on. There were still nobles who kept a careful, cool distance from the palace's human consort, who addressed Rennick with exactly the correct formal courtesy, and not 1 degree more, who clearly still believed, in some private unspoken ledger, that the old suspicions Adden had warned them about on that first delegation visit hadn't been fully retired so much as postponed. Rennick had stopped expecting that particular ledger to balance out entirely. He'd learned, across 2 years of quiet mornings and long council sessions and the occasional cold formal dinner, that it didn't actually need to. Enough of the court had come around slowly, The way a whole planet came around to anything, not in one dramatic gesture, but in 1,000 small, ordinary days where nothing went wrong, where the sky didn't fall, where a mechanic from a border station scrapyard turned out to be exactly as steady and unremarkable and quietly reliable standing beside a throne as he had been standing beside a workbench. And the steadiness itself, given enough time, did more convincing than any speech could have. Vesa governed the way she'd promised Adin she would, slowly and honestly rather than fast and fragile, rebuilding trust in careful measured seasons rather than grand sweeping gestures, and the old law she'd invoked to keep Rennick at her side, the one written 4 centuries earlier by lawmakers who could never have pictured exactly this outcome, had by the 2nd year stopped being cited in council chambers as a controversial exception, and started being cited, quietly, as precedent twice already. By other Ilan nobles choosing partners the old bond caste hierarchy would once have dismissed without a second thought. That more than the throne room or the coronation or even the tribunal that had first cracked Dreith's careful lie open in front of 200 witnesses was the part Rennick found himself thinking about most, on the mornings when the weight of everything they'd built together threatened to feel too large to hold steady. Not the crown, not the title. Just the quiet, accumulating fact that a law meant to excuse one impossible choice had slowly become a door other people were finding the courage to walk through too, one careful season at a time, the same way a hand-painted sign on a rainy market row had once, against every reasonable expectation, turned out to be the beginning of something considerably larger than either of the 2 people standing in front of it that day had any right to expect. He thought about the sign often still, 2 years on, not with anger anymore that had burned itself out somewhere in the 1st year, replaced by something quieter and more useful. He thought about it the way you think about a hinge a whole door had once swung on, small and unremarkable and entirely necessary. 4 careless words a broker had scrawled without a second thought that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation the docks or the market or the whole indifferent galaxy had ever offered either of them, turned out to be exactly wrong. Somebody had wanted her. He had, from the very first morning, standing in the rain outside a stall he'd walked past 1,000 times without stopping, for reasons he still couldn't fully explain except to say that some truths simply refused to stay hidden behind a sign, however carelessly it was written, however completely the world around it had already agreed to believe the lie. And 2 years later, with a queen's hand steady in his and a whole reopened kingdom slowly relearning what it meant to be governed honestly, Rennick Vale understood, finally and completely, that he had never once needed a crown, a court, or a single formal document to know that particular fact was true. He had only needed to stop, that first rainy morning, and actually look.